Chapter 2952. I've always had the will to live. Otherwise, I would have appeared in front of you the moment you appeared. The incarnation of the former worlds will smiled faintly. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and did not mind it too much. When he said that he had the will to live, he didn't really mean that he didn't have the will to live, but that the strength of the will to live was strong enough to suppress his own adaptation. However, there was no need to explain this at this moment. In any case, the incarnation of the former worlds did not need his explanation. You have betrayed your mission and denied the fundamental purpose of your birth. The worlds said faintly. I just want to live a little longer. The incarnation of the former worlds said faintly. Live? Could it be that you have forgotten what your true nature is? Is the concept of living something that only living creatures have? Does it really mean anything to you and me? You have been assimilated by him. He injected the concept of living into your will and made you have the illusion that you want to live. Don't you feel that you have actually become a loophole in this tribulation? The world's will's voice did not change at all, as if what the incarnation of the former worlds said was a cliché to it. Perhaps you're right, but so what? I want to live. This is what I truly feel. No matter how this feeling came about, it is what I truly want now. The incarnation of the former worlds said faintly. However, it did not waver because of the words of the world's will. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan had already deduced the entire process of the incarnation of the former world's will. It was very obvious that back then, the world's will, or rather, the incarnation of the former world's will, felt that it could no longer suppress the urge to perish together with itself, and its heart was extremely against this outcome. As such, in the end, it used what Luo Fan had done in the core of the world back then to form a huge incarnation, and then completely transferred its will into that incarnation, directly breaking away from the main body of the world's will. After that, because it lost the control of its will, the main body of the world's will could not effectively react to the outside world for a certain period of time. This was why Luo Fan felt that the reaction of the will of heaven and earth was too negative and not as positive as before. However, after a period of buffering, the main body of the world began to give birth to a new will. This new will completely replace the role of the former incarnation of the will of the world on the main body, and because it was a new will that was born from emptiness. This new will did not have the desire to live that the original body had, and it did not seem to have any desire to live at all. After he was born, he completely abided by the will of the world. In other words, he abided by the mission of simulating the birth of the primal chaos. He chased after Luo Fan fiercely. He wholeheartedly wanted to kill Luo Fan and complete this calamity that would last for an extremely long time. It was clear that the former incarnation of the will of the world was standing on the opposite side of him. It was precisely because of this that he stood on the opposing side of the world while in the war. Of course, this did not mean that he was on the same side as Luo Fan. Although he had broken free from the influence of the main body of the world will, and his desire to live would not be suppressed by the sense of mission, he did not completely break free from his essence. At the end of the day, his essence was still the incarnation of the will that simulated the chaos, the world's will of this world. Under such circumstances, it was obviously impossible for him to completely get rid of this simulated primal chaos state. In other words, this was the mission that Luo Fan's seventh Great Tribulation had given him, the meaning of his existence. In this way, for the incarnation of the former world's will, the desire to live and the mission, or rather the purpose of his existence, were like a balance. When his life was threatened, he would naturally stand on the side of the desire to live and fight against the new world's will. If Luo Fan's side gained the upper hand and his life was not threatened, his sense of mission would instead take the upper hand, allowing him to stand on the side of the world's will. Of course, at the end of the day, all of this was the result of his fear of death. After all, whether the worlds will obtain the final victory and got rid of Luo Fan, or whether Luo Fan obtained the final victory and got rid of the world's will, for the incarnation of the former world's will, or rather, the original body of the world's will, it clearly represented death. because once the victor was decided, it represented that this great calamity had come to an end. The end of the calamity would mean complete death for both the middle-aged man and the world's will. Therefore, maintaining the balance between the three sides was the most beneficial outcome for the middle-aged man, who was also the incarnation of the former world's will. The middle-aged man's objective was destined to be the biggest troublemaker in this battle. This tribulation can't last forever. You should know this. The worlds will set indifferently. It will last as long as it can. Who knows when I will be able to surpass this calamity? The middle-aged man's expression did not change at all. Since the calamity was a calamity, it naturally could not last forever. Although Luo Fan had dealt with the calamity 6 times in the past, it did not mean that the end did not exist. In fact, since the calamity was something that the chaotic state had done specifically for Luo Fan, it was naturally completely different from the perfect world or the great world. Then, it was naturally completely different from a perfect world or a great world. It was impossible for it to ignore time and continue forever. If it could really last forever, wouldn't such a calamity be no different from the great world? In fact, in comparison, it might even have an advantage over the great world, which was that it might be much vaster than the great world. In fact, it might be countless times vaster. All this time, Luo Fan had never encountered it. That was only because the time he spent in the predestined calamity had yet to reach the end of that time. In fact, even though the mechanism had not been triggered yet, anyone with a slight understanding of the calamity would know that as a calamity, there would definitely be a corresponding mechanism. This mechanism would allow the power of the calamity to continuously increase as time passed. At a certain point in time, this power would probably increase to a level that nothing in the great calamity could withstand. This included the cultivators that Luo Fan was targeting, as well as the world's will that had appeared in the great calamity, as well as the previous incarnations of the world's will, as well as all the other creators of the world. Once it developed to that point, it would obviously be bad luck for all existences in the great calamity. In fact, the world will had no choice but to appear before Luo Fan and personally deal with Luo Fan. It could be said that this mechanism was already working. After that, the world will had no choice but to use its incarnations to escape to avoid being pressured further. This could be said to be a sign that the mechanism was working. Surpass? How can it be simple? This great calamity itself limits the highest level of everything. Wanting to find a way to surpass this great calamity under such restrictions is simply a fool's dream. The worlds will said plainly. That's what surpassing is, the middle-aged man said with a faint smile. From the looks of it, it seemed like he had already thrown caution to the wind. Seeing this, Luo Fan suddenly smiled and said, "One is pursuing a mission, while the other is pursuing surpassing. I'm thinking, why don't the two of you fight it out first? Anyway, I don't care how long it takes." Hearing this, the world's will and the middle-aged man fell silent. It was obvious that no matter how much conflict they had, they would not agree to such a ridiculous suggestion. Even an ordinary person with a bit of rationality would not agree to such a suggestion, let alone the world's will that had almost all intelligence and its predecessor. Looks like we can't convince each other. The middle-aged man sighed and turned to leave. Verbal communication was extremely powerless for existences at their level. Even if it was a small decision, since they had already made up their minds, they would not change their minds easily. It was almost impossible for them to be changed by verbal communication. Their conversation at this moment was actually driven by an inexplicable sense of loneliness. After all, just as Luo Fan had said before, in this vast and boundless world that seemed to contain endless worlds and a simulated primal chaos created by the creators of these worlds, there were only the 3 of them who were truly of the same kind and could communicate with each other. All other living beings and creators of the world were like ants to them. To them, communicating with them was no different than talking to a pile of ants. Luo Fan shook his head and sighed. He turned around and retracted his senses, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. The worlds will also fell silent. Currently, Luo Fan's vast territory had been enveloped by the huge barrier that resembled chaos. The ocean within the barrier looked more and more like the realm sea that the living beings in the world thought of. And those worlds also looked more and more like the worlds born in the realm sea. Because of the barrier that resembled chaos outside the territory, the living beings in the world's understanding of the realm sea seemed to have been verified. After all, in the knowledge of all living beings, there was boundless chaos outside the world, which was clearly in line with the vast barrier that enveloped the territory. That barrier looked like a primordial chaos to Luo Fan. The existence of the barrier was clearly stopping his power from conquering the outside world. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron's suppressive power was continuously sent into the barrier, trying its best to penetrate the barrier and step into the boundless territory that belonged to the world's will. However, the barrier was so mysterious that it could easily accommodate the suppressive power that even the man-made worlds could do nothing about. Moreover, through various subtle and indescribable transformations, it completely dispersed the suppressive power, making it unable to penetrate the barrier at all, let alone affect the boundless world behind the barrier. Luo Fan clearly could not accept such an outcome. At this moment, the thoughts of his many clones circulated and they quickly made a decision. In an instant, the three-legged cauldron was forcefully pushed toward the barrier. In Luo Fan's territory, Luo Fan's clones had all the authority. With this kind of authority, it would be extremely easy for him to do anything he wanted in his territory. Moving the three-legged cauldron was impossible for any accidents to happen. Not long after, the three-legged cauldron came into contact with the barrier. At this moment, a mysterious fluctuation began to spread out in all directions from the point of contact between the three-legged cauldron and the barrier. Vaguely, there seemed to be thunderous sounds, as if the world was collapsing, coming from the barrier. At the same time, the three-legged cauldron was constantly trembling with a mysterious power. The suppressive power that originally belonged to the three-legged cauldron seemed to have become chaotic at this moment. It constantly leaked out from the three-legged cauldron, forcefully distorting the surrounding space and turning it into all sorts of strange and subtle forms. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan revealed an indescribable expression. Evidently, this scene before him meant that his three-legged cauldron was not completely helpless against the barrier. Although the three-legged cauldron and the barrier seemed to be in a stalemate at this moment, and the three-legged cauldron even seemed to be at a disadvantage, the fact that it could come into contact with the barrier meant that the three-legged cauldron could really affect the barrier. This in itself meant that it had a chance to win and break the barrier completely. After all, if it couldn't even come into contact with the barrier, how could the three-legged cauldron affect the barrier? How could it really break the barrier and affect the boundless world behind it? Chapter 2953. As the three-legged cauldron strengthened itself in all aspects, the pressure it exerted on the barrier also became stronger. The ripples produced from the point of contact between the three-legged cauldron and the barrier also became more and more obvious and clear, and the range of influence also became wider and wider. An inexplicable depression even began to appear on the barrier. At this moment, the man-made will of the world outside the barrier began to stir violently. The whirlpool suddenly sped up a lot, and an indescribable will appeared out of thin air from the whirlpool. It began to cover the barrier and forcibly reinforced it. For existences at the level of Luo Fan and the others, anything related to them had incredible power, be it cultivation, perception, aura, name, or even simple concept of existence, and so on. It was the same for consciousnesses. At their level, consciousnesses also possessed incredible power. At this moment, when these consciousnesses strengthened the barrier, it was as if the man-made world had directly attached itself to the barrier. In just an instant, the barrier seemed to have become several times thicker. The barrier that had been gradually squeezed into a bulge was smoothed out again at this moment. The ripples that had appeared on the barrier had also completely disappeared at this moment, as if they had never appeared in the first place. Facing this situation, Many of Luo Fan's clones couldn't help but frown. This situation was actually not beyond his expectations. After all, since the man-made world had constructed such a barrier, it naturally wouldn't sit back and watch the barrier collapse completely. Seeing that he had some effect on the barrier, it would naturally react and use some means to strengthen the barrier to make up for the impact it had suffered. From this point of view, the change in the barrier at this time was actually not strange at all. However, even though it was not strange, he saw that the barrier was about to be broken and that his three-legged cauldron was about to squeeze through the barrier. But the barrier suddenly strengthened again, making all his previous efforts go up in smoke. This was obviously not a pleasant experience for him. Therefore, even though he had expected such a change, Luo Fan still couldn't help but frown when it happened. However, it was obvious that even though all his previous efforts had been smoothed out, Luo Fan wouldn't give up so easily. Although the barrier had been restored to its original state, it was obvious that his three-legged cauldron could still really touch the barrier and affect it. In this way, as long as he continued to strengthen the power of the three-legged round cauldron and continuously enhance its effect on the barrier would not remain unshakable forever. It would eventually be broken one day. He had absolute confidence in this. At this moment, he didn't stop pressuring the barrier, but his focus was no longer on the three-legged cauldron. He had many means to strengthen the three-legged cauldron's power. However, among the numerous methods, the truly powerful ones that could truly double the power of the three-legged round cauldron could only be obtained from the outside. In other words, he had to make all sorts of plans in order to achieve it. And these plans were naturally the numerous worlds that belonged to Luo Fan's territory at this moment. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron's power was actually from the many Tribulation Realm powerhouses that had been conquered by Luo Fan previously. This kind of power was naturally more than enough to deal with existences like cultivators. At the very least, it was more than enough to deal with the Tribulation Realm powerhouses who were shackled by the simulated chaotic state and couldn't break through to the 7 Tribulation Realm. Even though the number of Tribulation Realm powerhouses might reach an unbelievable level, it was still the same. However, this didn't mean that this was the three-legged cauldron's potential. In other words, it didn't mean that this was the combined power of all the powers in Luo Fan's territory. In fact, behind the power gathered by the three-legged cauldron, there was still more power that had yet to be gathered. Previously, the three-legged cauldron had only gathered the power of Tribulation Realm powerhouses. However, how could the power of Tribulation Realm powerhouses compare to the real world? Before this, just the power of countless Tribulation Realm powerhouses was enough. But now, since the power and might of countless experts in the Tribulation Realm could not do much to the barrier, it was obvious that it was necessary to gather the power and might of heaven and earth. At this moment, among the many clones that Luo Fan had created, some directly went to the territories that had just been conquered and began to enter the worlds in those territories one by one. Although those worlds had already been conquered and had now become his territory. However, it was obvious that those worlds were still a little incompatible with the overall structure of Luo Fan's territory. After all, those worlds had only just been conquered. For the living beings in those worlds, they still clearly remembered the various things that happened when those worlds did not belong to Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, the living beings in those worlds naturally could not wholeheartedly join Luo Fan's side, and it was impossible for them to completely change their views. In the past, as long as there was enough time, after the living beings in those worlds had changed a few times, this barrier would naturally disappear without a trace. However, now that he was in a stalemate with the barrier, Luo Fan obviously did not have that much time to wait for those worlds to automatically integrate into his territory. Therefore, he had to personally change those worlds, or rather, transform them. After Luo Fan's clones entered those worlds, they directly seized the supreme authority of those worlds. No matter what, those worlds could only accommodate the existence of peak Tribulation Realm powerhouses. It could be said that Luo Fan's existence was already within the limits of what those worlds could bear. It was imaginable how much weight he had in those worlds. In addition, the essence of those worlds had already been changed, so they were naturally very close to Luo Fan. This made it so easy and natural for him to seize authority. After seizing the authority of those heavens and earth, Luo Fan began to infiltrate those heavens and earth with his worldview, transforming them bit by bit. This kind of infiltration of the worldview wasn't to completely transform the worldview of those worlds into the worldview of laws. Instead, it was to unify those worlds. At the very least, it was to unify them from the perspective of worldview, so that the worldview of those worlds had a sufficiently large proportion. As long as the structure of this point of convergence was completed, those worlds would truly be able to connect with all the other worlds that belong to Luo Fan's territory, thus completing the basic premise of Luo Fan's next actions. This transformation wasn't difficult. At the very least, it wasn't difficult for Luo Fan's incarnation. In just a short period of time, the many new worlds gradually emitted an aura that belonged to the worldview of laws. Although it wasn't strong, it didn't really change the appearance of the entire world. But for Luo Fan's purpose, it was already enough. In just a few days, the completed transformation of the world had already equaled the number of billions of newly conquered worlds. When a number was truly equal, Luo Fan's incarnation moved again. For a time, countless mysterious information began to jump between the countless worlds. In the blink of an eye, it began to spread towards Luo Fan's entire territory like lightning. In the end, it even spread to the world of laws. After repeated expansions and transformations, the world of laws was still an unimaginable behemoth in his territory. In terms of size, it wasn't something that any other world could compare to. It could even be said that even if billions of worlds were combined together, it might not be comparable to the world of laws. Such a heaven and earth of laws was insignificant compared to the heaven and earth formed from the tribulation level, but it had already surpassed an ordinary heaven and earth. Its might and power had reached a level that was completely unimaginable to ordinary worlds. It could be said that this world of laws alone was already equivalent to billions of worlds. At this moment, the power and might of the world of laws were stimulated at the same time and began to join the wonderful resonance that spread throughout Luo Fan's entire territory. With the existence of this resonance, some kind of indescribable light was constantly transmitted between the many worlds. It began to gradually unite the countless worlds into a whole. Endless power was constantly communicating within this entity, and finally, it gradually gathered above the world of laws. Then, through the connection between the world of laws and Luo Fan's clones, the power was easily dispersed to Luo Fan's countless clones, causing the clones of Luo Fan to almost collapse from the infusion of power and might. Fortunately, many of Luo Fan's clones were already prepared. At this moment, they didn't hesitate at all and directly poured the power that had gathered and dispersed to the countless clones into the three-legged cauldron that was resisting the barrier. As the power were poured into it, the three-legged cauldron began to expand wildly. The three-legged cauldron was originally already incomparably huge, and even the world seemed a little insignificant compared to the original three-legged cauldron. But now, as the power were poured into it, the three-legged cauldron expanded even further. In just a short period of time, its entire size had expanded by more than 100 times, and it even seemed to be comparable to Luo Fan's world of laws. Such a size had even faintly exceeded the area that Luo Fan had just conquered. For the barrier, it was no longer a small that could be ignored like before. At the very least, it had grown from a small dot to the size of a palm. After expanding like this, waves of unsuppressible suppression power were constantly released from the three-legged cauldron. Under this suppression power, the surrounding barrier that wanted to come into contact with the three-legged cauldron began to distort involuntarily and began to be flattened. Even the mysterious existence inside the barrier that was like chaos seemed to have become clear at this moment. Even Luo Fan could see through the barrier and see the vast area behind it. Obviously, The leakage of the suppression power was because Luo Fan's clones could no longer fully grasp the power of the three-legged cauldron. After all, the three-legged cauldron was currently gathering the endless power and power of the world that belonged to Luo Fan. Compared to the power and power of the many tribulation powerhouses from before, it was more than 1,000,000 times stronger. Luo Fan could fully grasp the three-legged cauldron that was formed from the power and power of those tribulation powerhouses, but it did not mean that he could still fully grasp it after it was 1,000,000 times stronger. It could be said that currently, he was able to restrict the suppressive power to this area and concentrate the target of the suppressive power on the barrier. Instead of allowing the power to spread endlessly and completely suppress the countless worlds in Luo Fan's territory, this could already be considered as an extremely difficult feat at this moment. The huge man-made worlds outside the barrier began to tremble violently. The consciousness that was originally attached to the barrier transmitted a terrifying pain to it at this moment. This pain was something that the man-made worlds had never felt before. Under this kind of pain, it could no longer maintain itself. Even its body was showing signs of collapsing. At this moment, the man-made worlds knew that it couldn't continue like this. If this went on, it would really collapse and collapse. At this moment, it hurriedly withdrew its consciousness that was attached to the barrier. As he withdrew his thoughts, the barrier no longer had the ability to resist the three-legged cauldron. In fact, the three-legged cauldron did not even need to use its full strength to smash against it. Just the terrifying suppressive force that leaked from the three-legged cauldron was enough to forcefully push open the barrier, causing a huge bulge to appear on the barrier. Chapter 29:54. The protrusion gradually revealed the outline of the thing that caused the protrusion. It was a hemispherical object with a long strip connected to the hemispherical object. Obviously, that was what the protrusion looked like when the three-legged cauldron stuck to something. The protrusion continued to increase as time passed. Unknowingly, cracks appeared on the edge of the protrusion, and at the location where the protrusion was connected to the barrier. As soon as these cracks appeared, they began to expand crazily. In the end, in a trillionth of a second, the barrier collapsed, and a huge hole was forcefully created by the three-legged cauldron. This hole was so huge that even if billions of worlds were filled in it, it might not be able to fill it. And this hole had obviously exceeded the limit of the barrier. After it appeared, the entire spherical barrier began to tremble violently. Countless cracks began to spread in all directions around the hole, and finally intersected on the other side of the barrier. In the end, the entire barrier completely cracked and turned into countless cracks. Accompanied by a surging impact power, it turned into endless shock waves that swept out in all directions. At this moment, the man-made will of the world surged violently, and all kinds of strange smoke escaped from the vortex. It seemed that a part of the man-made will of the world had collapsed. As expected, I can't completely restrain you so easily. At this moment, such a voice came from the man-made will of the world. The voice seemed to be rather young, but also seemed to be very old. It sounded like a man's voice, but also like a woman's voice. It seemed to be extremely pleasant, but also extremely penetrating. Just a little, Luo Fan's incarnation said faintly at this moment. It was obviously extremely normal for the man-made will of the world to have self-awareness and know how to think. After all, for existences at Luo Fan's level, it was not difficult at all to create living beings' intelligence and self-awareness. Since it was not difficult to create existences with self-awareness, then wasn't it reasonable for existences at this level to have self-awareness? However, you're still a little too late. At this moment, the strange voice spoke again. As he spoke, a huge palm reached down from the void and grabbed one of the legs of the three-legged cauldron that had just broken through the barrier. This palm was so huge, so solid, and so solid. It looked like a solid materialization. Although the way it appeared was condensed from nothing, its essence was not illusory at all. After it appeared, it directly penetrated the overwhelming suppressive force around the three-legged cauldron and forcefully grabbed one of the legs of the three-legged cauldron. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron was stimulated and began to release a large amount of suppressive power. It quickly poured into the palm, causing the palm to violently tremble. Compared to the size of the palm, the trembling was nothing. At most, it was the trembling of an ordinary person due to nervousness. However, if it was compared to the size of the palm, which was comparable to billions of worlds, the trembling was unimaginable. At this moment, if ordinary living beings saw this trembling, they would discover that it was as if the world was turning upside down, as if there was an overwhelming existence sweeping through countless worlds. The changes on the surface of the palm were as if the world was changing in an instant. At this moment, the palm grabbed the three-legged cauldron with great difficulty and quickly retracted it. Of course, this speed could only be seen from the perspective of ordinary living beings. From a macroscopic perspective, the speed at which the palm was retracting could only be considered extremely slow. The reason why such a slow movement would appear so fast in the eyes of ordinary living beings was naturally because even though it was slow, due to its size, the distance it moved in an instant was unimaginable. In comparison to the world, the speed at which it moved in an instant could cross countless worlds. Even though this speed seemed slow on the whole, in the eyes of ordinary living beings, it was already unimaginably fast. It was just like the trembling from before. In a macroscopic perspective, it was just an extremely subtle tremble, but in the eyes of ordinary living beings, it was an earth-shattering tremble. At this moment, Luo Fan's many clones entered the three-legged cauldron one by one, strengthening it with their own bodies. The three-legged cauldron's ability to control the power it contained, and its power began to increase greatly. With this increase, the three-legged cauldron's control over the suppressive power it released became unimaginably powerful. Under this control effect, the suppressive force began to restrain. In the end, although it was unable to restrain all of the suppressive force into one, it was able to restrain most of it, leaving only a small amount of it to escape. However, even though it was only a small portion of it, it had already greatly strengthened the suppressive power in a certain direction that Luo Fan hoped for. Under this strengthening effect, the inside of the palm began to rumble endlessly. The rumbling was so dense and intense. Amidst the rumbling, terrifying impacts were continuously generated from the inside of the palm. They kept erupting and rushing out in all directions, gradually causing countless strange bumps and bumps to appear on the surface of the palm. It seemed like it would explode at any time, causing the entire palm to shatter. However, the explosion did not happen in the end. The palm was simply too huge. Moreover, the power that the man-made worlds will had added to the palm was simply too powerful. Although the power of the palm could not compare to the suppressive power released by the three-legged cauldron in terms of quality, there was still a huge disparity between the two in terms of quantity. Although Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron had condensed almost all of the worlds in his territory, including the power of the world, the power of the world could not be forgotten. The power of the world condensed by the man-made worlds was far greater than those in Luo Fan's territory. Moreover, it wasn't just 1 or 2 times more, but tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of times more. A glass of water could extinguish a candle, but could a glass of water extinguish a bonfire? Could it extinguish a fire on a house? That was the case now. In terms of quantity, the three-legged cauldron suppressive power had an advantage over the palm, but in terms of overall size, the disparity between the two was still extremely great. This kind of disparity was not something that a small difference in quality could overcome. Therefore, no matter how hard Luo Fan's incarnation condensed the suppressive power of the three-legged cauldron, it couldn't really break free from the palm. At this moment, the palm suddenly grabbed the three-legged cauldron and smashed it down. Below them, there was a spherical barrier. This spherical barrier was much smaller than the one outside Luo Fan's territory. It felt like it was even smaller than the three-legged cauldron. However, judging from the quality of the barrier, it wasn't much different from the one outside Luo Fan's territory. At this moment, The moment the three-legged cauldron was smashed down, the barrier suddenly collapsed and disappeared without a trace. A rather vast territory appeared. A territory that belonged to the incarnation of the former world's will, or rather, the predecessor of the current world's will, appeared. Although this territory was much smaller than Luo Fan's territory, there were hundreds of millions of worlds within it. At this moment, such a world appeared without any concealment under the three-legged cauldron, waiting for the three-legged cauldron to smash down. With the size of the three-legged round cauldron and the suppressive force that lingered around it, if the many worlds in this territory were to be smashed by the three-legged round cauldron, not even 1 out of 100 worlds would be able to survive. Faced with such a change, the expression of Luo Fan's incarnation became extremely ugly. This was clearly the man-made worlds while using his power as a weapon to force him to attack the territory of the predecessor of the world's will. Attacking the territory of the predecessor of the world's will was not unacceptable to him. After all, to him, everything in this chaotic simulation was his enemy. They were all existences that he had to destroy and defeat. Under such circumstances, the predecessor of the world's will was naturally a part of his enemy. Therefore, he did not feel repulsed by attacking the territory of the predecessor of the world's will and completely eliminating it from the power of the karma of war. What made him feel repulsed was that this kind of attack was not what he wanted at all. Now, attacking the territory of the predecessor of the world's will was completely the result of being forced by other existences, and it was completely out of its control. This was the source of his displeasure. At this moment, a middle-aged man appeared out of thin air under the three-legged cauldron and raised his hand to block the three-legged cauldron. This middle-aged man was the appearance of the predecessor of the world's will, as well as the incarnation of the former world's will. However, compared to the appearance that Luo Fan was familiar with, the size of this middle-aged man was completely incomparable to before. Previously, he had only been the size of a normal person, but now he was indomitable. Compared to the three-legged cauldron, the palm was still extremely small, but it was already larger than tens of thousands of worlds added together. At this moment, the middle-aged man raised his hands, and a boundless and terrifying aura escaped from his body. It swept in all directions, stirring up countless distortions in the surrounding void. It was as if his existence had already exceeded the endurance of the void. This is summoning his own cultivation path. At this moment, the hearts of many of Luo Fan's incarnations shook, and they all understood how the middle-aged man had appeared in front of them. Due to the restrictions of the karma of war, the incarnation of the former worlds should not have been able to personally participate in this war. This could be seen from the successive victories of Luo Fan's side over the past million years, and the former worlds had been forced to retreat step by step. However, at this moment, the middle-aged man's image had directly appeared below in the territory of the former world's will. He wanted to help the world and all living beings in the territory to resist the three-legged cauldron that was crashing down. This was clearly against the restrictions of the karma of war. However, the truth was the truth. Even if he had violated the restrictions, the middle-aged man's appearance was still his appearance. Since he had appeared at this moment, there must have been some sort of change. Or rather, he had used some sort of method to bypass the restrictions. With the perception and reasoning abilities of Luo Fan's incarnation, he quickly deduced what method the middle-aged man had used to achieve this based on the aura of the middle-aged man. It was obvious that the middle-aged man that had appeared was not the incarnation of the former world's will. It was merely the product of the endless power and might of the world fusing with the middle-aged man, or rather, the cultivation path of the former world's will. For the world's will, it did not care about the path of cultivation. After all, the world was its body, and all the power in the world was its power and power. There was no need for it to cultivate at all. If there was no need for it to cultivate, then it was naturally impossible for it to have a path of cultivation. However, it was different for the middle-aged man. Although he was originally the world's will, he was no longer the world's will. He had already lost the various conveniences and inconceivability of the world's will. For him, if he wanted to grow, if he wanted to improve, if he wanted to unleash his own power, might, and divine abilities, he naturally needed to cultivate. Of course, he needed a path of cultivation. Therefore, the worlds did not have a path of cultivation, but the former worlds had its own path of cultivation. Moreover, because it was the predecessor of the will of the world, there were countless choices in its path of cultivation, and there were also countless combinations. Obtaining a powerful path of cultivation that could unleash the greatest power and might was naturally something that could be easily found. That was why the middle-aged man was so powerful, and why he still had the courage and confidence to block the three-legged cauldron. Rumble. Chapter 2955. The three-legged cauldron paused in the void. At this moment, it was as if time and space had completely stopped. It seemed like it was only an instant, but it also seemed like it would last forever. Until the end of time, at some point in time, time flowed again. The middle-aged man's body exploded at this moment. His body, which was the size of countless worlds, seemed to be bursting from the inside by a terrifying power. In the blink of an eye, his entire body turned into countless fragments that scattered in all directions. The strength of this body could be seen from how it could even stop the three-legged cauldron. It went without saying how powerful the terrifying power that could cause this body to explode would be. Although most of this terrifying power was consumed in the process of making the body explode, it was self-evident. However, even if there was only a little bit of it left, the power was already beyond imagination. In just an instant, the surrounding time and space had already fallen into a state of absolute distortion and chaos. An indescribable grayness was brought up by the boundless fragments. It looked as though the fragments were constantly giving birth to grayish chaos. If there were only a limited number of fragments, these grayness existences would at most form long traces. However, there were simply too many fragments that had exploded at this moment. Moreover, they were simply too dense. As a result, the grayness brought out by them intertwined with each other and turned into a large expanse. It was as if chaos had invaded this part of the world. It began to rapidly spread out from the direction where the middle-aged man had exploded, gradually spreading to a wider and wider area. The three-legged cauldron continued to smash down under the huge palm's grip without the slightest bit of relaxation. The murky chaos was unable to obstruct it at all, allowing the three-legged cauldron to easily pierce through it. Then, the cauldron ruthlessly fell towards the ocean below, along with the boundless world above it. There was a powerful suppressive force around the three-legged cauldron that was constantly leaking out. This suppressive force was not emitted by the three-legged cauldron on its own. Instead, it was emitted involuntarily under the pressure of the palm. After all, if it did not emit enough suppressive force, the three-legged cauldron would not be able to withstand the terrifying power and might produced by the palm. The suppressive energy that was being emitted was clearly being used by that palm. At this instant, the area before the cauldron that was affected by the suppressive force, regardless of whether it was space, ocean, or anything else, was instantly suppressed by the suppressive force. They couldn't even move, let alone gather any ability to resist the cauldron. What a pity! Luo Fan's clone had an inexplicable expression on his face as he sighed inwardly. Following his sigh, the three-legged cauldron finally smashed into the ocean, forcefully crushing countless worlds. In just an instant, the middle-aged man who was hiding somewhere in the sky could not help but let out a furious roar. At the same time, his entire body exploded, turning into countless fragments. It was as if he had turned into smoke, squirming in the void with great difficulty. After a long while, it turned into a whirlpool. After that, the vortex gradually shrunk and turned back into the middle-aged man. At this moment, in the world below, the territory that belonged to the middle-aged man had completely turned into a state of chaos. Even if it was space-time, laws, energy, matter, and so on, everything else had completely turned into a state of extreme chaos. All of this was now surrounding the three-legged cauldron, as if it wanted to restore stability and return to the normal state of the world, but it was impossible to do so. At this moment, an incredible suppressive force erupted from Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron. This suppressive force spread far and wide, completely covering the void within a range of billions of light years. In this range of billions of light years, everything was completely frozen. That included the giant palm. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron shook slightly and broke free from the control of the huge palm. As it broke free from the control of the huge palm, the space-time within a range of billions of light years completely collapsed. Everything turned into a state of chaos in an instant. This range of billions of light years did not only involve the territory of the middle-aged man. There was also a large part of the territory that did not belong to the middle-aged man, but the territory that belonged to the will of the world. Everything in the middle-aged man's territory had completely collapsed and was completely annihilated by the three-legged cauldron. Everything, all living beings, and all cultivators had completely turned into a part of the chaos. In this state, even if the suppressive force completely collapsed and erased everything in this area, it would not affect the things in this territory at all. If chaos was added to chaos, how much more chaotic could it be? However, this kind of suppression was completely different for the territory of the will of the world. It was the territory that belonged to the will of the world, and there were countless worlds around the middle-aged man's territory. The original purpose of their existence was to guard against the power that developed in the middle-aged man's territory. Therefore, the density of them was naturally quite impressive. At the very least, in terms of quantity, it would not be much less than the worlds in the middle-aged man's territory. At this moment, the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron turned everything within its range into chaos. In an instant, it destroyed countless worlds in the territory. It was just a wave of change, but trillions of worlds had been completely turned into chaos, and trillions of tribulation initiation stage powerhouses were completely wiped out. Currently, not a single living being could survive in this chaos. Even those who had reached a certain level in the tribulation initiation stage, equivalent to experts who had survived several great tribulations, could not survive under the violent suppression of the power. However, amidst such a change, the hole in the sky where the will of heaven and earth resided instantly expanded by a large margin. The area of that circle was roughly the same as the area that had been completely crushed by the suppressive power. Clearly, although the territory belonging to the middle-aged man, or the incarnation of the former world's will, or the predecessor of the world's will, had been destroyed under the control of that huge palm. With Luo Fan's subsequent actions, the credit for the destruction of this large area had clearly been transferred to Luo Fan in the eyes of the karma of war. Because of this transfer of credit, this area was now Luo Fan's territory. Even if this territory was extremely chaotic, as if it was in a state of chaos, the expansion of his territory would naturally reflect on the residents of the will of the world, causing the hole in the space-time where the will of the world resided to expand correspondingly. Facing this situation, Luo Fan's avatar did not show the slightest bit of joy. There was only an indescribable solemnity. Although it seemed that he had obtained a huge benefit at this time, he had occupied the territory that he had originally been unable to occupy. However, he was not completely safe at this time. Although the giant palm had withstood the blow of the explosion of the suppression force, it seemed to have turned into chaos on the surface, as if it had been completely shattered. However, the truth was that only the surface layer of the palm had shattered at this moment. The real body of the palm was still intact. This also meant that he was not completely safe at this time. He still could not take back the three-legged round cauldron completely. If he relaxed at this time, the palm might exert force again in the next moment to control the three-legged round cauldron again. In that case, the three-legged round cauldron might instead smash onto his territory, causing his territory to suffer the same fate as the middle-aged man's territory. Under such circumstances, how could he not be cautious? The power of the three-legged round cauldron was self-evident. Previously, The middle-aged man had used his own cultivation path to combine the power and power of the endless heaven and earth in his territory to form an avatar. Its power could be said to have reached an unbelievable level. If it really targeted cultivators in heaven and earth, it could be said that in this simulated state of chaos, no cultivator or heaven and earth could withstand it without suffering any damage. However, such an existence faced the three-legged round cauldron, which Luo Fan had exercised some restraint, but it only delayed for a moment before it was completely crushed. The power of the three-legged round cauldron was imaginable. If the three-legged round cauldron was controlled by the palm again and smashed on a Luo Fan's territory, Luo Fan was not confident that he could block it with his territory. At this moment, the three-legged round cauldron began to move rapidly. As an incredible suppressive force surged, it quickly stabbed towards the palm that seemed to have turned into a chaotic palm. Previously, the three-legged round cauldron had completely crushed a large area of the middle-aged man's territory and the territory of the will of heaven and earth. This was actually not because the three-legged round cauldron suddenly became stronger. Instead, it was because the three-legged round cauldron had no scruples in this area and did not care that its territory would be damaged. In other words, the three-legged cauldron itself actually contained this kind of power. The reason why it did not erupt earlier was because he had some scruples in his heart and did not want this power to affect his territory. Previously, when it came to this area that did not have its own territory, it could naturally release its potential without holding back. It did not have to worry that this explosion would affect the heaven and earth and the cultivators in its territory, let alone that this explosion would affect the three-legged round cauldron's own power. After all, the power and power of the three-legged round cauldron could be said to be the result of the countless heaven and earth in Luo Fan's territory and the countless cultivators in it. If the heaven and earth were damaged, the cultivators in it would also be damaged. Then, the power of the three-legged round cauldron would naturally be affected. Even if Luo Fan did not care about the survival of the heaven and earth in his territory and the lives of the many living beings, just to maintain the power of the three-legged round cauldron, he could not allow the power released by the three-legged round cauldron to affect the many heaven and earth and cultivators in his territory. At this moment, the three-legged round cauldron also used a similar concept to erupt its power. In the process of this eruption, the surrounding void, the surrounding laws, and even the great Tao were constantly being crushed and destroyed. Who knew how many billions of light years of space and time became more and more chaotic due to this change? If it was said that some Tribulation Realm powerhouses could survive in this chaos before, after being crushed by this oppressive force, even Peak 6 Tribulation powerhouses could not maintain their vitality in this chaos. This suppressive force condensed with great difficulty and ruthlessly stabbed into the palm-shaped chaos. At this moment, a huge vortex began to gather above the three-legged round cauldron. Of course, to put it more accurately, the center of the huge vortex began to shift from its original position to the top of the three-legged round cauldron. After all, the huge vortex had already covered the area where the three-legged round cauldron was, but the center was not here, but in another area. The palm that withstood the suppressive force over and over again began to quickly shrink back towards the center of the huge vortex. Very quickly, he had completely disappeared within it. At this moment, Luo Fan did not relax at all. He could still clearly feel the terror of the storm that was about to come. Obviously, the man-made will of the world did not retract the palm because it wanted to give up on continuing to attack Luo Fan, but because it had other ideas to attack Luo Fan. Soon, a thought appeared in his mind. Huge seals were produced from the center of the vortex, and like a giant mountain, they fiercely pressed down on the three-legged round cauldron below. Boom, boom, boom. Chapter 2956. This time, a terrifying shockwave was produced along with a roar. It was a terrifying shockwave that seemed insignificant in comparison to the heavens and the earth. This shockwave spread throughout the world even faster than the huge rumble. In just an instant, everything in this world sensed the sudden impact. This included everything in the territory of the will of the world, as well as everything in Luo Fan's territory. Even the products of the world's creators that had merged with this great world felt the impact at the same time. During the collision between the seal and the three-legged cauldron, the surrounding space-time completely collapsed, and one could even vaguely see the simulated state of chaos behind the collapsed space-time. That's right, it was not the kind of chaos that was similar to the state of chaos, but the simulated state of chaos. It was the simulated state of chaos that was created by the seventh tribulation to support the endless world creators, the tribulation layer, and the existence of the will of the world. However, the impact had already broken through all the foundations of this world and directly opened up a path that led straight to the state of the primal chaos. This degree of destruction was many times stronger than the previous chaos that was similar to the state of chaos. However, it was obvious that this destruction could not last long. The volume of this great world was so incredible, and it was imaginable how strong the self-recovery ability of this great world was to maintain such a volume. At this time, although the space-time around the three-legged cauldron had been completely destroyed, it was ultimately only a small, insignificant part of this world. It was just like a small needle tip on a person's body. Under such circumstances, with the self-recovery ability of this world, it did not take much effort at all. It only needed to contract a little, and the endless self-recovery ability would gather and rapidly close the cracks that led to the simulated chaos state, turning those areas into nothingness, a nothingness that was a part of the foundation of this world. In this way, the area around the three-legged cauldron seemed even more chaotic. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron trembled violently, and endless suppressive power was constantly leaking out from within, destroying everything in all directions. The surrounding area was getting wider and wider under the pressure of this suppressive force, constantly being destroyed. At every moment, there were thousands of worlds completely collapsing and countless trillions of living beings perishing at the same time as the worlds collapsed. From the perspective of war karma, all of this was clearly due to Luo Fan's efforts. As a result, the hole in the space-time where the will of the world resided was growing larger and larger. This meant that in the eyes of the karma of war, Luo Fan's territory was growing larger and larger. Faced with this situation, the man-made will of the world did not care at all. It only focused on suppressing Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron with the seal, as if it wanted to completely destroy the three-legged cauldron no matter the cost. At this moment, there were some experts in the surroundings who noticed the drastic changes in the world and the arrival of the apocalypse. For a time, they were terrified and wailing, and they didn't know how to face this terrifying calamity that even the heavens and the earth were about to be completely annihilated. Only existences at the level of tribulation cultivators would have a chance of survival. Of course, it was only a tiny bit. The impact that could destroy the heavens and the earth was simply too terrifying. The speed of the tribulation cultivators was not fast enough for them to escape the range of the impact. Moreover, this was under the condition that their world was intact. Only then would they be able to maintain their strength. Once the world was destroyed, even if these tribulation cultivators did not fall in cultivation, they would definitely suffer great damage. If they could not escape the range of the disaster before their worlds were destroyed, it would be useless even if they escaped the world that they were born in. After all, how could they resist the impending disaster after suffering great damage? At this moment, in the face of the suppression of the seal, many of Luo Fan's clones were trying their best to find a way to resist. The seal obviously condensed endless power and might of the world. The number of worlds was many times more than the number of worlds condensed by Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron. It was precisely because of the huge number that it could bring so much pressure to Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron. Otherwise, even if the number of worlds condensed by the three-legged round cauldron was much greater than the number of worlds condensed by the three-legged round cauldron, it would still be very easy for it to destroy the seal, given how profound the structure of the three-legged round cauldron was. Of course, it was only natural that things would develop this way. To the will of heaven and earth, its greatest advantage was its size. In the past, it was unable to display its size for more than 1,000,000 years because all the worlds could not be perfectly unified. Even if the tribulation cultivators of the world cooperated with each other, it was only the cultivators themselves. It was impossible to shake the barrier of the world. But now, with the successful appearance of the man-made will of the heavens and earth, the barriers that originally existed between the heavens and earth had been broken. All the heavens and earth were controlled and unified by the man-made will of the heavens and earth. All the power and energy could be controlled and condensed at will by the man-made will of the heavens and earth. In this way, its potential could finally be displayed perfectly. This was why its advantage in size could be clearly displayed in front of Luo Fan and suppress Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron. The only way to break this advantage was to surpass the other party in terms of technique. After all, the difference in size was too great. Under such a huge gap, even if Luo Fan wanted to narrow the gap between them in terms of size, it would be an almost impossible task. No matter how hard he tried, could he increase his territory by hundreds or thousands of times. It was not easy to surpass the other party in terms of technique. At this moment, the many Luo Fan avatars in the three-legged cauldron communicated with their senses and instantly reached a consensus. In the end, all of Luo Fan's avatars began to quickly gather towards one of the avatars in the center. Their figures disappeared in an instant and continued to merge with that avatar. As more and more avatars merged, the aura of the avatar that was merged with Luo Fan began to gradually change. Suddenly, crackling sounds came from the avatar's body. Immediately after, the avatar's aura skyrocketed by who knew how many times. It directly broke through the bottleneck that had been shackling it and stepped from the peak of the sixth tribulation to the seventh tribulation. However, this wasn't the end. As the incarnation continued to integrate, the realm of the remaining incarnation continued to rise. At the same time, the three-legged cauldron also began to tremble slightly. This trembling was different from the trembling caused by the suppression outside. Instead, it was a trembling that came from the inside. The trembling caused by the suppression from the outside was the trembling of the entire body. However, the trembling this time was caused by every single detail in the three-legged cauldron. Even the tiniest part was trembling, eventually forming a trembling. The two trembles intertwined with each other, making the three-legged cauldron look like it could not bear the heavy burden. It was as if it would completely collapse in the next moment. At this moment, the countless powerhouses that had entered the tribulation suppressed in the three-legged cauldron began to scream in pain. As they screamed, their bodies, their strength, their might, their consciousness, their thoughts, and even their essence began to gradually melt and disappear in an indescribable manner. The disappearance of every powerhouse that had entered the tribulation was a form of comfort for the three-legged cauldron. The power and strength of the three-legged cauldron began to grow. The disappearance of every powerhouse that had entered the tribulation also caused the trembling of the three-legged cauldron to ease. It did not directly eliminate the trembling, but instead slowed it down a little. The three-legged cauldron seemed to be on the verge of collapsing in the next moment. However, in the end, the three-legged cauldron became even more stable than before. Previously, the three-legged cauldron felt like it was about to be completely destroyed by the seal. However, at this moment, even though the intertwining tremors continuously shook the three-legged round cauldron, causing it to look very unstable, the special characteristic that it could be completely suppressed and destroyed at any moment had completely disappeared. The man-made worlds will above that had shifted the center over began to rotate even faster at this moment. Unknown existences were constantly being released from the man-made world's will, and they gradually fused with the seal. They constantly strengthened the seal, causing the seal's essence to continuously improve and sublimate, causing its suppression power to continuously strengthen. Under this enhancement, the shock wave produced by the collision between the two began to continuously strengthen. The range of its impact was also constantly increasing. The destruction of the world was also increasing at an even faster rate. However, the man-made worlds did not care about all of this at all. At this moment, the man-made worlds had already felt an indescribable uneasiness. This uneasiness made the man-made worlds no longer care about anything else. It only wanted to completely wipe out the three-legged cauldron and the numerous clones of Luo Fan in it. Even if it would have to pay a huge price to do so, it would not hesitate. However, it was clear that its efforts only increased the destruction of the world. It did not have much effect on its real target, the three-legged cauldron. Time passed bit by bit, and the man-made worlds had unknowingly become crazy. At this moment, the shock wave produced by the collision between the seal and the three-legged cauldron had already spread to an extent that was tens of thousands of times wider than the original territory of the middle-aged man. Such an area, compared to Luo Fan's original territory, was already at least hundreds of times larger. Because it was originally meant to guard against the middle-aged man's territory, the world in this area was more densely packed than the other areas. As a result, as the shock wave spread out, the amount of destruction in this world had reached 100 trillion. Every single living being in that world had to be counted in 100 trillion as well. Adding it up, the amount of living beings that had been destroyed was self-evident. The amount of destruction had even affected the stability of the man-made world's will. The man-made worlds seem to have become a little thinner than before. Although it was not much, it was still very thin, which meant that its foundation had already been greatly affected by the previous losses. After all, the man-made worlds was formed from the power and might of the world that belonged to the world's will. The foundation of such an existence was naturally everything in the world's will's territory. At this moment, the loss of the world would naturally affect the stability of the man-made world's will. At this moment, the numerous figures of Luo Fan's avatars that were continuously gathering into the three-legged cauldron had completely disappeared. The countless tribulation stage experts that existed had also completely disappeared. At this moment, only one of Luo Fan's avatars was left in the three-legged cauldron. It was not that all the avatars were left, but that everything except him had disappeared without a trace. This included the countless space-time, worlds, and worlds that originally existed, as well as all the living beings and cultivators within. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron was empty, and only one of Luo Fan's avatars remained. However, this avatar of Luo Fan was completely different from the countless avatars from before. This avatar was currently surrounded by a perfect quality, and its strength and cultivation realm were countless times stronger than the countless avatars from before. Chapter 29:57. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron had become the carrier of Luo Fan's incarnation and was recognized by the karma of war. In this decisive battle, the karma of war had clearly taken control of this great world. For the karma of war, anyone who wanted to become a tribulation cultivator in this great world was clearly going against it. It was a violation of the rules and the limits of karma. This was like playing chess. If you wanted to win, you had to fight with your wits and courage on the chessboard. If you fought with your wits and courage outside the chessboard, it would be considered a move outside the chessboard. Obviously, for the existence that restricted the rules of chess, this was clearly an inappropriate behavior. In reality, such moves were simply unavoidable. This was because the existence of the rules of chess could not restrict things outside the chessboard. For the karma of war, the territories of each party in the decisive battle were the chessboard. More specifically, the territories of each party in the decisive battle were the chessboard, and the areas outside the chessboard were the areas outside the chessboard. The living beings were obviously the many chess pieces on the chessboard. The chess pieces had to grow on the chessboard to conform to the rules of chess. If they grew outside the chessboard, it would obviously be considered a move outside the chessboard. As mentioned before, in reality, or rather, in the real game of chess, moves outside the chessboard could not be truly restricted because the existence that set the rules of chess did not have that kind of power. However, it was obvious that such restrictions did not exist for the karma of war. The karma of war clearly had the ability to restrict the existence of moves outside the chessboard. In this decisive battle, if a cultivator wanted to grow, they could only grow in the various worlds. They could not grow outside the world that gave birth to them. This was the only way to conform to the rules of the karma of war. It was precisely because of this that any cultivator could only rely on a world if they wanted to truly improve themselves. Even if it was Luo Fan's incarnation, it was the same. Without a world to rely on, even if its realm and power were sufficient, it would not be able to improve further. Therefore, over the past millions of years, although Luo Fan's incarnations could reach the peak of the Seventh Tribulation, their actual realms were limited to the peak of the Sixth Tribulation, unable to break through. At this moment, what the Tribulation realm powerhouses needed to do was create a vessel that could hold a peak Seventh Tribulation realm cultivator. In other words, this three-legged cauldron. Previously, the numerous clones of Luo Fan seemed to have only fused with one of his clones. But in reality, most of it was used to strengthen the three-legged cauldron, increasing the strength and level of the three-legged cauldron. Through such a transformation, the three-legged cauldron was strong enough to withstand the existence of a peak Seventh Tribulation cultivator. This was not simple at all. Moreover, he would have to pay a huge price. At the very least, Luo Fan's numerous clones have been reduced to a single one at this moment. It was so much so that during this process, the energy and might of the world that had temporarily gathered on the three-legged cauldron that belonged to Luo Fan's territory had been completely devoured by the three-legged cauldron, causing the essence of the world to weaken greatly. In just an instant, countless Tribulation realm powerhouses were injured physically and mentally, and their strength was greatly reduced. It could be said that in terms of overall strength, it was difficult to say whether the overall strength of Luo Fan's territory had increased or decreased. In fact, it was precisely because of this that Luo Fan did not make up his mind to use this method in the past millions of years when he thought of it. However, it was clear that he had no choice but to use it at this moment. At this moment, the man-made worlds will gather the boundless might and power of the world within its territory and came crashing down on him. If he didn't gather enough power to sublimate himself and increase his power, he wouldn't be able to resist at all. Since that was the case, it was only a matter of time before his overall strength was strengthened or weakened. Therefore, he made up his mind to use this method. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation, who had reached the peak of the Seventh Tribulation, constantly emitted the trait of perfection. The trait of perfection was so strong that it constantly intertwined and collided with the trait of perfection released by the three-legged cauldron. It made the surroundings of the three-legged cauldron seem to have become a part of the perfect world. It began to naturally repel everything around it. This even included the huge seal that was pressing down from above. Of course, this rejection was only slight and faintly discernible. It was so much so that it was simply unable to block the power of the seal. The seal merely exerted a bit of force to repel this rejection. It suppressed the three-legged cauldron again. After all, the power of the seal was gathered from the power and power of the world in Luo Fan's territory by countless times. The three-legged cauldron would not be a match for it at all if it only relied on strength to resist. It was clear that the three-legged cauldron had only just completed its sublimation, and Luo Fan's incarnation had not truly gained control of it yet. Under such circumstances, it was clear that the three-legged cauldron was only relying on the power it emitted instinctively to resist the seal formed by the will of the world. In other words, its power was many times weaker than the seal itself. In that case, it was only natural that he would perform badly and be easily suppressed. However, at this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation quickly reacted in the face of such a predicament. With a slight thought, countless dimensions instantly unfolded around it. The seal that was originally pressing down on Luo Fan was instantly divided into an unknown number of dimensions. Or rather, countless layers of attributes were absorbed into the countless dimensions. In just an instant, the seal, which had an absolute advantage over the three-legged cauldron, was already divided into countless parts. Even though every single part of it was much stronger than the three-legged cauldron and had a clear advantage over it, it was still much stronger than the three-legged cauldron. However, it was clear that the seal's advantage over the three-legged cauldron in each dimension had been weakened to an acceptable level after being split into so many dimensions and an unknown number of parts. After all, a difference of billions of times and a difference of hundreds of times was obviously a completely different concept. At least, for Luo Fan, this was a completely different concept. At the very least, it was a completely different concept for Luo Fan. However, a difference of hundreds of times was not difficult. Therefore, at this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation felt the pressure around him decrease greatly. The terrifying opponent that he could not resist at all and even made him feel despair suddenly weakened to a level where he could deal with and resist. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation directly controlled the three-legged cauldron and began to attack one of the dimensions, targeting a certain layer of attributes of the seal. The many layers of attributes of the seal were completely different. Some of them were quite powerful, while others were quite sturdy. However, some of them were quite weak and fragile. This kind of weakness and fragility was enough to make this layer of attributes lose a lot of advantages against the three-legged cauldron. At this moment, Luo Fan's incarnation was targeting this kind of weakness and fragility. Obviously, with this kind of advantage, his strength had reached the level of a peak 7th Tribulation expert. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron fail? In just an instant, the shape of the seal began to change, as if a part of it had begun to crumble and shatter. Then, this crumbling and shattering continued to expand, and finally affected the entire seal, causing it to collapse completely, turning into endless powder and vanishing without a trace. At this moment, the man-made worlds above began to wriggle rapidly. A faint voice was heard. How is this possible? This voice contained a kind of indescribable shock and terror. The complete destruction of the seal might have surprised the man-made world's will, but it was not enough to frighten it. However, what Luo Fan did to the seal was completely beyond the scope of the man-made world's will's understanding. For the man-made world's will, this kind of existence that was completely beyond its understanding was the source of its confusion and panic. Now, it had no idea how the other party had destroyed its attack and how the seal had disappeared. Then who could guarantee that this kind of attack would not affect its body? Who could guarantee that it would not die without knowing why? It was precisely because of this uncertainty that it was shocked and frightened. At this moment, Luo Fan obviously had no intention of telling the three-legged cauldron how he had done it. At this moment, he turned his gaze to the huge vortex above. This was a rare opportunity. His method had taken shape, but the other party did not know what it was and did not know how to deal with it. This was the only time such a good opportunity would come. Next time it would not take long. It would only take a short while for the man-made worlds to know what was going on. Perhaps it would figure out how to deal with it, or at least how to prevent it. In this regard, Luo Fan had enough confidence. He was confident in the man-made worlds since he knew this. He naturally would not let go of this opportunity. At this moment, he stared straight at the vortex manifested by the powerful man-made will of the world above him. As power surged, the three-legged cauldron brazenly rushed up and crashed into the center of the huge vortex. At this moment, the huge vortex began to stir violently. Endless, unimaginable power gathered from all directions towards the center, crushing and restraining the three-legged cauldron. It wanted to completely restrain the three-legged cauldron. However, right at that moment, the three-legged cauldron started to release dimensions that continuously enveloped the vortex in the surroundings. These dimensions were the same as the previous ones. They were also fused with many planes and used the power of many planes to forcefully divide the plane of reality into countless plane attributes that were compatible with many planes. The power of this division was extremely terrifying. It could even deal with the Worldswell in the past, but because the Worldswell was too huge and terrifying, this method could not really deal with it. At this moment, the cultivation realm of Luo Fan's clone had already risen to the peak of the 7th Tribulation. This was not much different from the realm of his main body. Previously, As Luo Fan's clone that was only at the peak of the Sixth Tribulation, this method of dividing dimensions was still very powerful. However, in terms of its range of effect, it was rather limited. At the very least, compared to his main body, the range of effect was much, much smaller. Under such circumstances, this method of division had no effect on the man-made world's will, which was also unimaginably huge, even though it was many times smaller than the world's will. As such, Luo Fan's clone clearly had this method of dividing dimensions, but he did not use it to deal with the man-made world's will. This was why he was in such a sorry state before. However, the situation was completely different now. Right now, Luo Fan's clone had already risen to the level of a Seventh Tribulation expert. His cultivation realm was not any weaker than Luo Fan's main bodies. With such a foundation, the splitting ability of this method was naturally powerful enough. Its range had also reached a level that was comparable to the range that the main body could reach. However, this range was enough to deal with the man-made worlds while moreover, because of the three-legged cauldron's assistance, this method was even more absolute and effortless. This caused Luo Fan to change his previous method and use this method of dividing dimensions to deal with the man-made world's will. At this moment, this method of dividing dimensions was unimaginably effective against the man-made world's will. In the blink of an eye, this method of dividing dimensions had already expanded to nearly 1,000 times the size of the three-legged cauldron itself. Chapter 2958. The range of the dimensional division didn't stop just because of this achievement. Instead, it continued to expand in all directions, dividing more and more parts of the man-made will of heaven and earth into an unknown number of attributes. Compared to the seal from before, these areas that belong to the man-made worlds were much weaker. For example, the claws and teeth that a living being used to attack other living beings were naturally much tougher than its own flesh and blood after those attributes were divided. Most of them directly froze in the dimension they were in. They could not move, struggle, or act on their own. Immediately afterwards, as Luo Fan thought in his mind, the three-legged cauldron launched a corresponding attack on those attributes, destroying them one by one. Faced with this situation, the man-made worlds will try its best to gather a large amount of power and power from various parts of the vortex towards the center. It tried its best to condense endless power and power to resist the dimensional division. It tried its best to break the countless dimensions again and gather the various attributes back into its true self. However, it was obvious that the gathering of power and power had a rather limited effect on the dimensional division. It was not that the power and power were not powerful enough, but that the two were simply incompatible. The man-made worlds will gathered endless power and power to deal with the dimensional division, but it was like scratching an itch through a shoe. It could not really land on the real thing at all. In this way, the effect was naturally rather limited. The possibility of truly mixing up the countless dimensions again was extremely, extremely small. This process lasted for several days. A few days later, after the man-made world will failed to mix up the countless dimensions using innumerable methods, he finally recognized the fact. He no longer resisted the dimensional division method with the same method. Instead, he forcibly created a barrier inside his body, completely separating the parts of his body that had been divided into countless layers of attributes by the dimensional division method from his entire body. Translator, Zephizi editor. Dioquin, even though the parts of its body that had been divided into countless layers of attributes were the central core of the vortex and could be regarded as an extremely important part of the man-made world's will, it was still the same. After establishing this barrier, the man-made worlds did not stop there. The various methods he had used previously made him understand how extraordinary the dimensional severing technique was. The man-made worlds will no longer dare to have any expectations as to how long this barrier would be able to withstand the dimensional splitting technique. Therefore, before the barrier was split into countless layers of attributes and easily destroyed, the man-made world will seize the opportunity to start the next round of attacks. In the blink of an eye, the main body of the man-made world's will which was the enormous vortex that covered the vast majority of this great world, suddenly disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. The man-made will of the heavens and the earth dodged in an instant and left this place of trouble. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's incarnation was slightly taken aback. He did not expect the man-made worlds will to make such a choice. After all, in his opinion, this kind of choice was meaningless. The monk could escape, but could he escape from the temple? The foundation of the man-made worlds was the countless worlds in the territory of the world's will. In this way, as long as the countless worlds did not disappear and were still under the shadow of Luo Fan's means, he would definitely be able to destroy the foundation of the man-made worlds will easily. Once the foundation was destroyed, how could the man-made worlds will continue to exist? From this point of view, no matter how well the man-made worlds will hid and how far it escaped, what was the use? Of course, although he thought this way, he did not stop his actions at all. At this moment, he took the opportunity to completely wipe out the remaining parts of the man-made worlds that had been divided by the dimensions that covered an unknown range of billions of light years. After that, he began to search for the existence of the man-made worlds in all directions and the depths of the void. Although directly dealing with the countless worlds was a method that could be used against the foundation of the man-made world's will, compared to directly targeting the man-made world's will and directly dividing its body parts before wiping them out, the efficiency was still slightly lower. Therefore, if there was a choice, Luo Fan was more willing to choose to directly target the main body of the man-made worlds rather than the many worlds that were its foundation. However, the way the man-made worlds dodged was clearly different from any dodging method that Luo Fan had seen before. It clearly did not directly hide in the depths of the void space-time, nor did it use some kind of stealth method to conceal its body. There were also other similar methods. Therefore, at this moment, when Luo Fan searched the countless space-time in the depths of the void, he realized that he could not find any trace of the man-made world's will at all. It was as if the man-made worlds had never existed in this world, and everything that happened before was just Luo Fan's own illusion. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan had a guess in his heart. Perhaps the man-made worlds had used some kind of indescribable method to disperse and hide in the endless world. If that was the case, the man-made worlds would naturally be the same as it was now, as if it had never appeared. Of course, in reality, if one were to look at it from a stricter standard, the man-made worlds could actually be treated as if it did not exist at all. After all, the man-made worlds itself was a whole formed by a certain metaphysical, strange existence of the endless world. Now that these metaphysical, strange existences had dispersed and no longer gathered, it was not wrong to say that the man-made worlds had completely disappeared and no longer existed. With such a guess in mind, Luo Fan naturally did not hesitate. Although the efficiency was a little low, he still directly attacked the endless world below. Previously, when he was dividing the man-made world's will's body parts, he did not conveniently erase the world within the range at the same time, although it was not difficult for him to do so. Therefore, at this moment, there were still countless worlds within the range of the three-legged cauldron's dimensional division method. The perspective of these living beings clearly could not truly transcend the world, so they naturally could not clearly see the battle between the man-made world's will and Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron above their heads. It was like an ordinary person living on a planet could not see the overall evolution of the entire universe. Therefore, at this time, the artificial will of the heavens and earth had already admitted defeat and fled. They still didn't feel any difference between the heavens and earth, and didn't know that their fate was completely in Luo Fan's hands. At this moment, with a thought from Luo Fan, the three-legged cauldron instantly released an incredible suppression force and fiercely suppressed the endless worlds below. In the blink of an eye, it had completely suppressed the boundless heavens and earth, causing it to freeze in the boundless realm sea. Immediately afterwards, Luo Fan's consciousness followed the suppressive force into the countless heavens and earth and began to directly modify the characteristics of those heavens and earth with a supreme realm that was countless levels higher than the heavens and earth. He erased the marks that originally existed in those heavens and earth that belonged to the will of the heavens and earth, and branded his own mark in the depths of those heavens and earth, causing the essence of those heavens and earth to undergo earth-shaking changes. As this change occurred, the hole in the space-time where the worlds will resided in the depths of the void began to expand bit by bit. Although the speed at which the hole expanded was not too fast, it did not stop, as if it could continue for an eternity. At this moment, the vortex behind the hole began to squirm faster. At the same time, a middle-aged man involuntarily appeared in front of the hole and faced it directly. The middle-aged man gave off an indescribable sense of chaos, as if he was just the condensation of a mass of chaotic things. However, he was doing his best to restrain the chaos, so the chaos did not directly show itself. The middle-aged man clearly did not appear here willingly. At this moment, he looked at the vortex with indescribable shock in his eyes, and his body instinctively wanted to retreat. However, the middle-aged man quickly thought of something and suddenly burst into laughter. He said, I understand. This time, you went for wool and came home shorn. So that's how it is. Now I don't need to worry about you being a threat at all. From a certain point of view, I have completely broken free from you. At this moment, a soft bang erupted from the middle-aged man's body. Along with this sound, the middle-aged man's body instantly exploded and turned into a cloud of smoke that showed signs of forming a vortex. However, it was as if time had been reversed very quickly. The countless wisps of smoke quickly dispersed before continuously converging, and in the blink of an eye, they converged back into the middle-aged man. This middle-aged man was naturally the predecessor of the world's will. He was also the existence that Luo Fan believed to be the incarnation of the previous world's will. The reason he had appeared here earlier was obviously because the vortex, or rather, the world's will, had found his existence and pulled him over in an attempt to completely destroy him here. However, it was obvious that the world's will's hopes had been dashed. Although the middle-aged man could not resist the absorption of the world's will and had been forcefully pulled here from his hiding place, the world's will's methods could not land on him at all. It could not truly kill him. The reason for this was actually very simple. Previously, the middle-aged man had left behind a contingency plan in the embryonic form of war karma. He had gambled everything he had. Because he had gambled everything, even if his territory was conquered over and over again, he could still rely on his own existence to regenerate his territory. It was also because of this that he could try again and again after a complete failure. This time, according to the contingency plan he had left behind, the middle-aged man, or rather, the predecessor of the world's will, could not be considered to have failed even at this stage. After all, his body still existed, and his territory still had a chance to be reborn. However, the current situation was no longer the same as it was over 1,000,000 years ago. In the past 1,000,000 years, the territory that did not belong to the three parties was almost boundless. If he wanted to be reborn in his territory, he could casually find an ownerless territory in the boundless world that did not belong to the other two parties to be reborn. Wouldn't that be enough? In this way, as long as his body still existed, he could be reborn no matter how many times he wanted, and he could extend his life no matter how many times he wanted. However, it was obvious that that was only in the past. Right now, apart from Luo Fan's territory, the entire world's will's territory was the world's will's territory. There was no longer a single area in the entire world that was ownerless, without an ownerless territory. Even if the middle-aged man's territory still had a chance to be reborn. Where could he be reborn to? And which areas could he turn into his territory? Evidently, at this moment, even if his main body still existed, it was impossible for him to possess any territory. The fact that he could no longer possess any territory meant that he had completely failed in this great battle. The result of this failure was that the preparations he had made as a contingency plan for the great battle had now ruthlessly tricked him. Of course, perhaps from another perspective, it could also be considered as saving him. This was because his contingency plan was to block everything he had. Therefore, after he failed in the great battle, everything he had would belong to the victor due to the limitations of war karma. Chapter 29:59. This was because the karma of war had determined that this incarnation of the former worlds will belong to Luo Fan. Therefore, in the upcoming process of this great battle, it could be said that he was already a force that belonged to Luo Fan. In this way, a situation had arisen. Before the outcome of this great battle was revealed, the restrictions of the karma of war still shrouded him. In other words, existences that didn't satisfy the requirements of the karma of war still couldn't hurt him. Evidently, the world's will wasn't satisfied with the requirements of being able to hurt the middle-aged man, or rather, the third party of the war. After all, the three parties had now become two parties. Although the middle-aged man had lost his identity as the third party, he had become a part of one of the two parties. Moreover, he was a party that was hostile to the world's will. As a result, Luo Fan was now able to deal with him at will, and even easily wipe him out completely. However, the world's will couldn't do anything to him. Just like at this moment, although the world's will could easily pull the middle-aged man in front of it, and even directly send its power into the middle-aged man's body, it still couldn't leave any lasting marks on him. It couldn't really hurt him. Faced with such a situation, it went without saying what the middle-aged man was thinking. At this moment, Luo Fan's main body, who was in the world of laws, sensed something and understood what was going on. With a thought, an indescribable power crossed through the layers of void in the blink of an eye and arrived in the depths of the void, where the worlds will resided, After arriving here, the vortex in the space-time where the worlds will resided, which was also the world's will, instantly sensed something. With just a thought, an incredible power followed the direction where the middle-aged man disappeared and quickly attacked the source of the middle-aged man's disappearance, which was where Luo Fan was. In just a flash, an incredible power crossed through space and arrived where Luo Fan was, ruthlessly suppressing Luo Fan. In just an instant, before Luo Fan could react, that incredible power had already collapsed in the blink of an eye, directly disappearing without a trace, as if it had never appeared. In fact, it didn't even affect the world in the slightest. If it weren't for Luo Fan's anticipation, he might not even have known that this kind of power had ever existed. The karma of war lives up to its name as expected of the powerful karma that the three of us work together to create. At that moment, he sighed and smiled at the middle-aged man who had just appeared. The middle-aged man sighed. Indeed, I'm actually a little regretful that I forged the karma of war to be as powerful as it is now. If I had gone easy on them back then perhaps I wouldn't have fallen to such a state. At this moment, the middle-aged man who had appeared here was the middle-aged man's true body. He was also the avatar of the will of the world, and also the true body of the will of the world. At this moment, there was an indescribable sense of detachment from his entire body, as if he had transcended some kind of fate and some kind of nature. Under such circumstances, and facing such a middle-aged man, Luo Fan had an indescribable feeling on his face. The middle-aged man in front of him was even more real than him, with more emotions and various characteristics of many living beings. In comparison, compared to him, and even in some aspects, he was inferior to him. In front of the will of the world, the middle-aged man appeared extremely proud, as if he was extremely satisfied with his current situation and extremely enjoying it. But in reality, who would really think that being completely controlled by someone else and having one's life completely in the hands of someone else was a kind of enjoyment? In this world, no ordinary person would think that way. Even if it seemed like an existence that enjoyed such a state, there would definitely be some kind of deep resistance in the bottom of his heart. This kind of resistance might not even be noticed by the person himself, but the emptiness that occasionally appeared from the bottom of his heart was the most obvious manifestation of this deep meaning. Even ordinary people were like this. As an existence that could control many worlds and overturn the world with a single thought, how could the incarnation of the will of the world enjoy this kind of treatment? How could it not think that this kind of treatment was a form of humiliation to itself? The reason why it had appeared so relaxed and happy before the will of the world was because this was the only way that the will of the world would be unwilling and displeased. This kind of unwillingness and displeasure was the only comfort that the will of the world could provide in this kind of situation. At this moment, in front of Luo Fan, who clearly controlled its life and even everything about itself, its comfort was completely ineffective. To Luo Fan, no matter what the middle-aged man did, it would not change the fact that his fate and everything else was under his control. Since this was the case, there was naturally no reason for him to act as if he was enjoying this kind of state in front of Luo Fan. Faced with such a middle-aged man, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "That's not necessarily true. Perhaps if you hadn't put in so much effort in the construction of the war karma prototype back then, you wouldn't have been able to last until today. After all, whether you admit it or not, whether it's me or the will of the world, neither of us is something that you can resist." Hearing this, the middle-aged man's expression froze slightly. Then, he smiled bitterly again. Indeed, to a certain extent, what Luo Fan said was correct. To Luo Fan, if he wanted to obtain the final victory, the only way was to obtain the final victory within the war karma rule. If he could not obtain the final victory, no matter how much ability he had, no matter how much he could do, he clearly had no ability to resist when faced with the will of the world and Luo Fan, who could easily crush him. Without the war karma rule to restrict the other two parties, he would have long since become a part of Luo Fan or the will of the world. At that moment, the middle-aged man sighed and said, "All right, I admit that what you said makes sense. So, how do you plan to deal with me now? As an enemy, as an existence that knows many secrets that you don't know, as an existence that was born because of you." Hearing this, Luo Fan still smiled and said, "Aren't you very clear? Since you know so much, of course I have to figure out everything that you know." At that moment, inexplicable despair appeared on the middle-aged man's face. At that moment, he didn't hesitate to activate the endless power in his body. Endless power began to frantically release from his body and wreak havoc in all directions. This kind of power was so strong, so huge, and so terrifying. In just an instant, the surrounding space-time was completely destroyed, causing traces of simulated chaos to appear in the surroundings. This situation meant that in just an instant, the middle-aged man had relied on his own powerful means to forcefully destroy layers of space-time. Not only did he destroy the core space-time of the world of laws, but he also destroyed the world itself, as well as the great world where the world of laws was located at this moment. Only in this way could he touch the simulated chaos that the great world was attached to after being destroyed layer by layer. From this, one could imagine how inconceivable it was to be destroyed so thoroughly. However, this degree of destruction was still insignificant to Luo Fan. For him, he only needed a slight thought to eliminate this complete destruction and all the deterioration of space-time. The reason for this was very simple. At this moment, he wasn't fighting alone, but there were too many things that were helping him, allowing him to easily eliminate any effects caused by the existence that was restricted by these things. For example, the war karma. At this moment, the middle-aged man, who was also the predecessor of the world's will, was still under the control of the war karma. On the other hand, the war karma had given a part of this control authority to Luo Fan. In this way, Luo Fan could naturally use the ability of the war karma to easily eliminate all the effects caused by the predecessor of the world's will on him. This was the same principle as the predecessor of the world's will being able to completely ignore any damage caused by the world's will. At this moment, what Luo Fan was using was only a similar principle. In addition, the power related to the true sage was also helping Luo Fan. This kind of help was only because Luo Fan was too close to that power, and any means of the predecessor of the world's will could affect that power. However, no matter what the reason was, help was help. The power related to the true sage repelled the actions and means of the predecessor of the world's will. Obviously, it was enough to help Luo Fan, allowing him to ignore any damage caused by the predecessor of the world's will. In the face of this situation, Luo Fan had an indescribable expression on his face, and his eyes showed an indescribable sense of ease. At this moment, he looked at the place where the predecessor of the world's will was. At this moment, the predecessor of the worlds will seem to have completely disappeared. Obviously, when it destroyed the surrounding space-time, the surrounding world, and even a part of that great world, it first destroyed everything that belonged to itself. This included its own body, its own strength, its own might, its own will, its own life essence, and the traces of its existence. At this moment, the predecessor of the worlds will had obviously completely erased everything about itself. If it was an ordinary living being, it might have completely forgotten the existence of the predecessor of the world's will. It might even think that Luo Fan was talking to himself, and there were no signs of communication with any other living beings. It could be said that the predecessor of the worlds will was able to do this. And it could be said that the predecessor of the worlds will was very determined. It was even willing to destroy itself to prevent Luo Fan from obtaining its secrets. However, it was obvious that this kind of behavior did not have much effect on Luo Fan. Due to the restrictions of war, the predecessor of the worlds could not be harmed by anything other than Luo Fan and Luo Fan's authorization. This included the world's will, and similarly, the incarnation of the world's will, which was the predecessor of the world's will, as well as the middle-aged man himself. Therefore, at this moment, it seemed that he had completely erased all traces of his existence, and even the memories left in the hearts of other living beings. However, as long as Luo Fan willed it, all these changes would disappear, and the terrifying power and the effects of the endless power would disappear completely. For example, this was what Luo Fan did at this moment. With a thought, time seemed to flow backwards, and the predecessor of the worlds appeared in front of Luo Fan from nothingness. It appeared at the core of the world. As expected, even death can't be decided. At this moment, the predecessor of the worlds did not show much unexpected behavior, and it only showed an expression of despair. It could also think of everything that Luo Fan could think of. In fact, it could think of things much faster than Luo Fan, and much more. In this way, Luo Fan knew what kind of authority he had over the predecessor of the world's will, and the predecessor of the worlds naturally knew this as well. Thus, his act of self-destruction could be said to be a form of resolute resistance. But from another perspective, it could also be seen as a form of probing. It was a kind of test of his own assessment, a test of Luo Fan's ability. Then, I should be able to read all your memories it will now, right? Luo Fan asked with a smile. The predecessor of the worlds said helplessly, "If I say no, will you stop?" "Of course not. If I don't use my authority, it will be invalid after it expires. Moreover, I really want to know the nature of the predestined fate," Luo Fan said. At this moment, an indescribable profundity appeared in his eyes, as if he could see through the endless barriers and see the supreme, unbelievable, and indescribable existence that existed behind everything. It was as if he had personally witnessed the earth-shattering power of that supreme existence. Chapter 2960. What's the point of looking at my memories about the essence of the tribulation? The predecessor of the worlds shook his head and sighed after a long while. He really wanted to know about the essence of the tribulation. It was just like how a person would definitely be interested in the world and universe that they were born in if they had the chance. For the predecessor of the world's will, the Great Tribulation was the world and universe that he was born in. However, even though he had such thoughts, having thoughts and being able to do it were two different things. The predecessor of the worlds really wanted to find out about the essence of the Great Tribulation and understand the cause and effect of his birth. However, his ability, authority, or something else was inexplicably restricted. This restriction ended his exploration of the essence of the tribulation before he could even begin. not to mention finding out any secrets. His understanding of the Great Tribulation might not even be as deep as Luo Fan's. Under such circumstances, the predecessor of the worlds would only behave this way when Luo Fan wanted to find the essence of the Great Tribulation from his memories. Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes living beings don't know what they know." Luo Fan did not care much about what the predecessor of the worlds will thought. The memories of living beings were extremely mysterious. Sometimes, things that one thought that one did not remember had already been firmly placed in the depths of one's memories. Normally, one would not have any concept of it. However, at a certain moment, due to some special atmosphere, special environment, or simply a flash of inspiration in one's mind, these originally hidden memories would suddenly surface. One would suddenly realize that, oh, so I remember these things, this situation existed in all living beings. However, the more powerful a living being was, the more perfect the living being's control over itself would be, and the fewer memories they would hide. However, no matter how little these memories were hidden, they could not completely disappear. Just like Luo Fan now, he didn't dare to say that he could clearly remember everything in his life. There must be some things that were hidden in the depths of his sea of memories. Usually, they wouldn't appear, and only under special conditions could they appear. The predecessor of the worlds will only shook his head and sighed. He had no ability to resist Luo Fan's decision, even if Luo Fan wanted to torture him. Making such a suggestion at this time was just the best he could do. When Luo Fan heard this, he felt that he would suffer less. Since Luo Fan didn't listen, he could only endure it. At this time, Luo Fan naturally would not waste any more time. A day or two, a year or two, or even thousands or tens of thousands of years were nothing to this great calamity. However, that was determined by the characteristics of the Great Tribulation itself. It was not a reason for him to waste time. The Great Tribulation could lengthen time at will through various laws. That was its privilege. Luo Fan was an existence that had been tested by the Great Tribulation, so he could only endure it. Just like the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth, Luo Fan was only the target of the Great Tribulation's test. He could only act according to the rules of the Great Tribulation. If he violated it, the power of the Great Tribulation would be greatly increased, and his chances of surviving the Great Tribulation would be greatly reduced. Therefore, wasting the time given to him by the Great Tribulation was obviously an extremely risky action. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. An indescribable power appeared out of nowhere and converged towards the body of the world's will. It rapidly converged towards the body of the world's will. In the blink of an eye, the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth let out a scream. Amidst this scream, his body suddenly exploded. From the appearance of a middle-aged man, he turned into a vortex that began to slowly spin in the void. During this process, the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth let out a continuous stream of screams. Along with the screams, a stream of information began to be forcefully extracted. Like rivers flowing into the sea, it quickly gathered towards where Luo Fan was and fused into Luo Fan's heart in the blink of an eye. This information flow was incomparably huge. It was like a great river, endless and never-ending. Even if Luo Fan's endurance was strong enough and the amount of information he could receive at every moment was unimaginable, it would still take him tens of thousands of years to receive all of this information. This was because the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth had completely become Luo Fan's side. Luo Fan only needed an extremely short amount of time to calculate all of this. From this, it could be seen just how many memories the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth had. However, this was also an extremely normal thing. After all, this was the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth. A large portion of the memories it possessed were actually the same as the previous incarnation's memories. What was the will of heaven and earth? It was formed by the gathering of a bit of spirituality from everything in the world. Everything in the world, even if it was an ordinary world, would have an unbelievably terrifying number. Moreover, the world that the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth represented was a terrifying world that was billions of times vaster than any world creator, even a perfect world. It went without saying how many things there were in such a world. It was also imaginable how many memories the spirituality of these things brought. From this point of view, the fact that Luo Fan was able to completely receive all of these memories in tens of thousands of years showed that his endurance towards information had reached an unimaginable level. Normally, other living beings would not be able to completely receive the memories of countless living beings in tens of thousands of years. Perhaps as long as they came into contact with a little bit of this information flow, their entire self and the essence of their life would be completely blown up. However, although it meant that Luo Fan was extraordinary to be able to receive all of these memories in such a short period of time, it was obvious that even such a short period of time was actually extremely extravagant for Luo Fan at this time. At this time, the great battle in the world had obviously reached its final juncture. Next, the outcome of the battle might be decided in an extremely short period of time. Either Luo Fan's incarnation would find the artificial will of heaven and earth, wipe it out, and then completely occupy all of the territory of the will of heaven and earth, including everything in the entire world. In the end, he would be able to control the will of heaven and earth like the previous incarnation and greatly advance the process of ending this great tribulation. Or, his incarnation would suddenly be careless at a certain moment, and the artificial will of heaven and earth would seize the opportunity to destroy him instead, thus obtaining the victory of the great battle. In turn, all of Luo Fan's territory, as well as his world of laws, would be under complete control. In that case, although Luo Fan would not be left with no way out, he would still be in an extremely difficult situation. He would probably only be able to hide within the power related to the true sage and linger on while at death's door. Regardless of which of the two outcomes it was not something that could be extended to tens of thousands of years before a result would appear. Therefore, for the current Luo Fan, it was obviously an impossible task for him to calmly receive all of this information for tens of thousands of years. Seems like I have to go with my main body. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The strength of his main body was not much stronger than this incarnation. From a certain point of view, his main body was actually slightly weaker than this incarnation. At the very least, his incarnation could rely on the power related to the true sage as sustenance, while his main body was just an ordinary seventh tribulation powerhouse. Furthermore, he had not undergone the seventh major tribulation and had only forcefully stepped into the realm of a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Under such circumstances, the strength of his main body was actually not much stronger than his incarnation. However, compared to his incarnation, his main body had an advantage, and that was that the perception of his main body was now tightly entangled by the power related to the true sage. At this moment, he sensed that the energy that was related to the true divine still maintained an incomparably mysterious and complicated trajectory. It seemed to be the outline of some kind of rune, some kind of formation, and even more so, it seemed to be a simple totem. Under such circumstances, he could not escape and could not truly be free. However, at the same time, this also allowed him to borrow more of the power related to the true sage than his incarnation. Although Luo Fan's incarnation was also attached to the power related to the true sage. However, what he had entrusted to him was only wisps and wisps of the power that was related to a true divine. Although it was also attached to the power related to the true sage, the support from that power was obviously quite limited. In contrast, the support from the power related to the true sage that his main body could obtain was obviously many times stronger. However, this kind of support actually required Luo Fan to use some corresponding means to be able to obtain it. With such support, as long as the method of exerting force was right, the power that his main body could exert and the impact that he could withstand would obviously be much stronger than what his incarnation could withstand. Because he clearly understood this, Luo Fan's incarnation would have such a thought at this moment. The incarnation and his main body were one and the same. Therefore, when the incarnation thought this way, it naturally meant that Luo Fan had already made a decision. At that moment, there was not even a need to discuss or make any sound. Luo Fan's main body had already taken the initiative to receive the information flow. The terrifying information flow began to frantically surge towards Luo Fan's main body along with the perception transmitted by the main body. The information flow was obviously unable to directly pass through the power related to the true sage and directly hit Luo Fan's main body. If it wanted to come into contact with Luo Fan's main body, it needed to go deeper into the power related to the true sage bit by bit and get closer to Luo Fan's main body. Moreover, because the power related to the true sage was so strong, this kind of approach could not be casually twisted. It still needed to obediently follow the path that existed previously and go deeper and deeper bit by bit and move forward bit by bit. At this moment, within the power related to the true sage, the original path that existed originally was only the path left behind by Luo Fan's perception. Therefore, at this moment, the information flow seemed to have entered a maze, constantly swimming and drilling around the power related to the true sage. It circled around the power again and again, forming an indescribably complicated and mysterious path that frantically approached the depths of the power, where Luo Fan's main body was. In this process, the original impact of the information flow began to rapidly dissipate. In the end, when it really reached Luo Fan's main body, the information flow was already like a gentle flowing water. In fact, it did not even make him feel a trace of pressure. It had already completely integrated into Luo Fan's memory and did not cause any abnormal changes at all. Obviously, all the pressure had already been completely vented in the process of circling around the path. Since there was no pressure, Luo Fan naturally would not continue to accept the information flow at a steady pace. At this moment, the entire body of the world's will was completely under his control due to the restrictions of the karma of war. He wanted to make it overflow with the information flow, or rather, the speed at which it overflowed was as fast as the speed at which it could remember. The reason why it could maintain this speed that required tens of thousands of years to completely overflow was because the speed at which Luo Fan's clone accepted the information flow was limited. However, that was not the case. This speed was already the limit. At this moment, as the will of Luo Fan's main body came over, the speed at which the information flow overflowed began to increase by thousands of times. With this increase in speed, the pain of the world will naturally increase by thousands of times. The screams that escaped from the depths of the vortex continued to grow louder and louder. In the end, it was as mournful as the cries of ghosts and gods. Just the sound alone could probably pollute countless worlds, causing the essence of countless worlds to begin to distort and be assimilated by the pain contained in the screams. Chapter 2961. Although Luo Fan sympathized with the pain of the predecessor of the world's will, he did not show any mercy. He needed to hurry up and obtain everything he wanted in the shortest time possible. For this goal, he even personally took action. He had even risked his life to borrow the help of the power related to the true divine. In the future, his actions might anger that power and bring him some kind of danger. If even he was in such danger, how could he pay attention to the feelings of the predecessor of the worlds that had fallen into his hands? At this time, he was just trying his best to increase the extraction of the memory of the predecessor of the world's will and speed up the flow of information. The flow of information was increasing by thousands and tens of thousands of times, but for Luo Fan's body, the pressure it brought was still almost non-existent. It was not much different from the pressure brought by the flow of information at the very beginning. This situation told him that the information flow was still not the limit of what he could bear. At the very least, it was not the limit that the power related to the true divine could help him bear. Therefore, he further urged the control over the predecessor of the worlds that he had obtained from the karma of war, and continued to further urge the extraction of the memory. He further accelerated the flow of information from the predecessor of the world's will. With just this pressure, the speed of the flow of information had increased by thousands of times. Compared to the beginning, this speed was already more than 10 million times faster. If this is the case, I should be able to absorb all the memories in a few months. Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and he already had a clear understanding of what this speed represented. From a speed that originally needed tens of thousands of years to the current speed, it only needed a few months to complete the absorption. One could imagine the magnitude of this improvement. At this moment, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. A few months was already a barely acceptable time period. However, it would be better if it could be faster. In this situation, it was clear that he could obtain a faster speed because the pressure he was under wasn't that great. This power that was related to a true divine was far more helpful to him than he had imagined at this moment. Even Luo Fan, who had used this method and borrowed the power related to the true sage, could not help but feel shocked. The more he understood this power, the more he felt how powerful it was. He also understood how important the 4 words related to true divine were. Now this power was on his side, or rather, it was on the side of transcendence. However, this was only temporary. Based on Luo Fan's abilities, it was impossible for him to predict what this force that was related to a true sage would do. How long would he be able to maintain such a transcendent state? Would he continue to be so transcendent that he would not help the Great Tribulation, nor would he help him? He had no way of knowing. Perhaps it would remain the same, just like before. Perhaps at some point, it would turn around and stand on the side of the Great Tribulation. It would directly attack him with the Great Tribulation, or in other words, test him. Who knew this? Therefore, the more he felt the power and wonder of that power, the more Luo Fan felt inexplicably worried. However, this worry would obviously not be revealed. After all, this kind of worry was meaningless. Even if he was worried, what could he do? He could not change the final outcome at all. If this power related to a true sage really stood on the side of the Great Tribulation, given his current relationship with this power, he was afraid that he would not have the ability to resist that power at all. This power would probably be able to get rid of him completely easily, regardless of whether he was vigilant, worried, or prepared. It was all the same. In this case, continuing to worry would only add to his troubles. Obviously, there was no meaning to it at all. At this moment, he could only continue to press on the previous body of the will of heaven and earth according to his previous plan and do his best to extract all the memories it had. When the extraction force was further strengthened, the previous body of the will of heaven and earth no longer screamed. It was not because it was used to this kind of pain, nor was it because the pain had disappeared when things reached an extreme, or because it had become an inexplicable comfort. Instead, it was because this kind of pain had already crushed his spirit. At this moment, the previous body of the will of heaven and earth could no longer make a sound. Even its rationality had been blinded by the pain, and it could not even control itself to do anything. However, although it did not make a sound, the negative emotions that emerged from its body were so strong that they directly distorted the surrounding space-time, faintly constructing an indescribable world of negative emotions. This world of negative emotions was so strange. It contained everything that a normal world would have, but everything was very different from normal space-time. It felt like some kind of unimaginable deterioration or an unimaginable distortion in the direction of deterioration. If this world was in any other place, it would be enough to completely assimilate and destroy the world it existed in. However, in this place in Luo Fan's world of laws, due to the restrictions of the karma of war, even though this world of laws looked incomparably terrifying and horrifying, it did not affect the surrounding space-time at all. In fact, it could not even spread out of the core space-time and truly affect Luo Fan's world of laws. This time, the information flow was already overwhelming. It was no longer like a flowing river, but a boundless ocean that flowed backward toward Luo Fan's body and frantically integrated into the power related to the true sage. Through the trajectory of perception left behind in the power, it quickly passed through the main body of the power and finally completely integrated into Luo Fan's body. It was effortless and did not leave a single trace. In just a few days, he had completed the task that would have taken him several months to complete and completely absorbed all the memories that could be forced out of the previous body of the will of heaven and earth. The amount of these memories was so huge that compared to Luo Fan's own memories, it was like comparing an ant to an elephant. If it wasn't for Luo Fan's brilliant means, strong self-confidence, and the protection of the worldview of laws, his ego might have been affected by this huge amount of memories. Of course, it was also because of this confidence that he dared to directly absorb those memories. At this moment, Luo Fan's body did not care about anything else at all. He was only focused on absorbing these memories and looking for the content that might exist in them that was related to the nature of this calamity. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone separated from the state of fusion with his body and faced the previous body of the will of heaven and earth that had been completely enveloped by the world of negative emotions. The previous body of the will of heaven and earth was indeed worthy of being the will of heaven and earth. Even the incredible pain from before couldn't completely destroy it. When the endless and incredible power that was extracted disappeared, the body of the previous body of the will of heaven and earth shook and completely tore the world of negative emotions apart. His entire body was revealed again. It was a miniature vortex that seemed like the will of heaven and earth. The vortex rotated slowly, continuously compressing and shrinking. In the end, it turned into a figure that looked like a boy and appeared where the vortex originally was. At this moment, the boy sighed and said with a somewhat disappointed expression, "I didn't expect that losing those memories could also be considered a kind of gain." At this moment, he looked like he had escaped from the deepest part of a dream. His entire body was filled with indescribable comfort and ease. Seeing this, Luo Fan's clone frowned. He realized that the situation might be a little out of his control. With a thought, he was about to use the control authority that the karma of war gave him to control the previous body of the will of heaven and earth. However, he realized that his control was completely ineffective. There seemed to be a thick barrier between him and the previous body of the will of heaven and earth. No matter how he tried to control it, it was like scratching an itch through a shoe at most. At most, it felt like he was scratching it, but it couldn't stop the itch at all. In fact, the more he scratched, the more itch it got. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly thought of a possibility and asked in disbelief, "You've given up on yourself?" From a more strict point of view, yes. The previous body of the will of heaven and earth looked at Luo Fan with an indescribable expression. It seemed to be a little disappointed, relaxed, satisfied, pained, and lost. As expected, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. If that was the case, it clearly made sense. The backup plan that he had left behind in the embryonic form of the karma of war was to bet everything he had. It was also because of this backup plan that he had been completely controlled by Luo Fan after he had completely failed in his own territory. It was self-evident what this him in betting everything he had represented. For existences that were not at a high level, that him might only be what his body represented. If that was the case, he would be betting everything he had. Naturally, it would be everything that his body represented. For existences of a higher level, this version of oneself might be a step further, representing one's own soul, one's own divine soul, one's own life essence. If that was the case, he would stake everything on himself. This self would be the existence of the divine soul, and the essence of life. However, for existences at Luo Fan's level, everything else was secondary. Even if it was the soul, the divine soul, the essence of life, and so on that seemed to be extremely important and crucial, it was still the same. Only oneself was the true key and the root of everything. If one lost oneself, even if everything else was fine, one would no longer be oneself. As long as oneself existed, even if everything else was lost, it would be something that could be completely restored with a single thought. Therefore, it was obvious that for existences at their level, the him embedding everything he had naturally represented one's self. In this case, if the previous body of the will wanted to break free from the restrictions of the bet and break free from Luo Fan's control over him, there was obviously only one way, and that was to change one's self. Oneself would no longer be the original self. As long as oneself was no longer the original self, then one's original self would be equivalent to completely disappearing. This naturally meant that oneself had indirectly broken free from Luo Fan's control over him. Of course, whether this breaking free from control was worth it or not, and whether it was meaningful or not, depended on the person. For Luo Fan, even if it was just a slight change in oneself, as long as the change was so great that the karma of war determined that he was no longer himself, then this breaking free would be meaningless. Instead, it would be more like stepping into an abyss. However, it was very obvious that the previous body of the will was more tolerant towards oneself. This breaking free was very meaningful to him. It's a pity that if I knew you had such thoughts, I definitely wouldn't have been so violent before. Luo Fan only sighed. It was actually not easy for the previous body of the will to give up on his own self. After all, in the eyes of Luo Fan and the karma of war, giving up on oneself and distorting oneself was clearly a form of self-harm. As for self-harm, when the previous body of the will was completely controlled by Luo Fan, it was clearly impossible for it to succeed. In other words, if the previous body of the will took the initiative to distort his own self and wanted to completely change himself, then the karma of war would determine that he was a different person in the end. Then it would definitely be impossible for him to succeed. It was the same reason why, when it wanted to perish together with Luo Fan, it was impossible for it to cause any harm to Luo Fan or itself. Therefore, the previous body of the will had clearly chosen to borrow Luo Fan's power to achieve this. It could not harm itself, nor could it distort its own self, but Luo Fan could. As long as he could use the means that Luo Fan had used on him and the changes caused by Luo Fan, he could achieve the effect of distorting his own self. Although it was not easy, it was still achievable. Chapter 2962. Luo Fan had directly made a move on the memories of the previous incarnation of the world's will. This in itself had already touched the edge of the world's will's self. If he took a step further, he could directly distort and change itself. Of course, to Luo Fan, the previous incarnation of the world's will was not important at all. What he needed was the various secrets that the previous incarnation of the world's will knew. Apart from these secrets, everything else did not matter to him. As for the previous incarnation of the world's will, what did it have to do with him if it maintained its original appearance or changed into another appearance? At least, that was what he thought before. Therefore, even if he took a step further and could manipulate the previous incarnation of the world's will at will, and could even mold itself into anything he wanted, Luo Fan did not have any thoughts of further molding itself. His methods only touched the first layer of the memories. If the previous incarnation of the world's will did not have any other thoughts, once Luo Fan's methods were over, its situation would definitely return to normal, and there would not be many changes. However, it cannot be helped. The previous incarnation of the world's will had clearly made up its mind at that time. It had taken advantage of the opportunity when Luo Fan made a move on its memories to forcibly reverse the various painful feelings caused by Luo Fan's actions. It had directly attacked its own self, causing its own self to directly bear the intense impact of all sorts of unbelievable pain, and it was an endless impact. This impact was enough to cleanse its own self again, causing itself to completely distort into a different appearance. Although this was the result of the previous incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth adding a bit of power to it, in the end, the root of it all came from Luo Fan's stealing of its memories. Therefore, this method could also be considered as a method of Luo Fan's. Therefore, it could truly be implemented on the previous incarnation of the world's will, and truly and completely change the previous incarnation of the world's will. The final result was this. The previous incarnation of the worlds had completely distorted into a different appearance. All its connections with its original body, and even all the characteristics and essence of its original body, had become completely different from before. Currently, he could only be said to be a brand new life form born from the corpse of the world's will. He could no longer be considered the world's will's predecessor. Because he was a completely new life form, he had lost all of his authority over this world. Even the countless memories that Luo Fan had obtained from him had almost been forgotten by him at this moment. At most, only some vague traces remained in the depths of his memory. It was also because of this that he felt relaxed, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. After all, it was not a simple matter to shoulder the burden of a great world. Previously, those memories that would normally take Luo Fan tens of thousands of years to bear had been pressing down on the soul of the predecessor of the will of heaven and earth. Who would believe that it was easy? Very decisive, but do you think you can escape just like that? Luo Fan sighed and said to the childlike creature in front of him. At this moment, the predecessor of the will of heaven and earth was already a brand new life form. In the eyes of the karma of war, it was no longer the original will of heaven and earth. From this perspective, it was obvious that it was just a life form that had just been born. That was why he looked like a little boy. The child smiled faintly at this moment and said, "Of course. I don't think I'm still useful to you now. And you obviously haven't killed to the point of destroying a useless existence." Although the child had completely broken free from Luo Fan's control, at least the control brought about by the karma of war. However, it was obvious that it was only related to the control of the karma of war. In other aspects, Luo Fan's strength was still incomparably powerful, and it was still far superior to the child in front of him. With such strength alone, it would be a piece of cake for him to manipulate the child in front of him. He only needed to release a bit of his power with a single thought, and he would be able to directly knead the child in front of him and make him pose hundreds of times. Not to mention that they were currently at the core of the world of laws. The world of laws obviously belonged to Luo Fan, and everything was under Luo Fan's control. Here, as long as Luo Fan was willing, he could easily do many things that he couldn't do in the outside world. For example, he could get rid of the cultivators who invaded this place. Therefore, although he had used the method of distorting himself and turning into a brand new life form to break free from the control imposed on him by the karma of war, the child was still under Luo Fan's control. His fate still changed according to Luo Fan's thoughts. Hearing this, Luo Fan laughed and said, "Although your compliment is very inferior, I have to admit that you've convinced me. The current you is meaningless to me. Killing you or keeping you alive makes no difference to me." An inexplicable smile appeared on the child's face, as if he was looking forward to something. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression changed, and he said, "However, if you want to obtain freedom just like that, don't even think about it." The child's expression changed. He had clearly said that he was useless to Yi Shiwen, and Yi Shiwen didn't want to kill him. If that was the case, shouldn't Yi Shiwen immediately tell him to scram? Why did the topic suddenly change to not give him freedom? Wasn't this turn of events too sudden? Why? The child couldn't help but ask. He obviously had no idea what was going on. Why was Luo Fan still unwilling to let him go even at this point? You can't possibly think that I'm the only one who wants to make a move on you, right? Luo Fan asked indifferently. His words caused the child's expression to change drastically. Clearly, he had thought of how terrifying the other existence who wanted to make a move on him was. For the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth, it had two enemies. One of them was Luo Fan. The other was his replacement, the current will of heaven and earth. In fact, before Luo Fan had extracted the core space-time of this world, he had directly appeared in front of the will of heaven and earth and faced it directly. If it wasn't for the restriction or protection of the karma of war, he would have been directly erased by the will of heaven and earth. Now, he had paid a huge sacrifice to break free from the restriction of the karma of war. This was undoubtedly a good thing for his current self. However, from another point of view, his choice had also broken free from the protection of the karma of war. Without the protection of the karma of war to the will of heaven and earth, he was obviously just an ordinary cultivator that could be erased at will. If he were to leave Luo Fan's territory like this, the consequences that would await him were self-evident. At this thought, his body couldn't help but tremble. However, at that moment, he did not look at Luo Fan with any grateful eyes. After all, he was quite clear that the reason why Luo Fan stopped him from leaving and didn't want him to be directly erased by the will of heaven and earth was actually not for any good reason. Instead, he was worried that the will of heaven and earth would become even more difficult to deal with after obtaining him. This was not a groundless worry. After all, he was the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth. Who knew if he had brought along something important to the will of heaven and earth when he split out? It naturally didn't matter if he didn't. How the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth died and was devoured had nothing to do with Luo Fan. However, it was better to be safe than sorry. What if the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth had brought along something important to the will of heaven and earth? Even if that thing wasn't that important, as long as it was of even the slightest benefit to the will of heaven and earth, it would obviously be a loss for Luo Fan. Therefore, based on this thought, Luo Fan wasn't willing to let the previous incarnation of the will of heaven and earth, or rather, the boy, leave freely and enter the pocket that the will of heaven and earth had opened up. So you'll have to survive in my world from now on. Perhaps you'll also have a good ending after I get through this calamity in the future, Luo Fan said indifferently to the boy. As he spoke, he swiped his hand, and the body of the boy in front of him trembled. Without being able to resist at all, he was forcibly sent out of the core of the world and thrown straight to a parallel place in the world of laws. In Luo Fan's world of laws, Luo Fan's authority could be said to be supreme, and his will was absolutely impossible to go against. At this time, he didn't even need to use any means, and the boy was completely dispelled according to his wishes. He became an ordinary creature with a long lifespan and was thrown into a parallel place that didn't seem much different from a normal world. He really doesn't leave me any loopholes. The boy fell into the parallel place and appeared in the wilderness. He looked around, but there was no one at all. Feeling the emptiness in his body that he had never felt before, an indescribable sense of helplessness emerged in his heart. After a while, he suddenly smiled and thought to himself, "This is good too. Without those powers, I might be able to live for real." With that thought in mind, he shook his head and slowly moved forward in a certain direction. In just a few steps, he had already condensed extraordinary power, causing his body to gradually emit a wondrous aura that didn't flow in the mortal world. After all, he was the predecessor of the world's will. Even if almost all his memories had disappeared, and even if all his powers were imprisoned by Luo Fan, as long as a trace of his previous memories was left behind, it would be enough for him to easily surpass the obstacles of ordinary creatures obtaining extraordinary powers. He could start from zero and become an extraordinary again. At this time, this was the case for the boy. The extraordinary power he obtained at this time was no longer the one he originally obtained from the world's will. Instead, it was an extraordinary power that he developed according to the characteristics of this world, or rather, this parallel world. This extraordinary power was completely rooted in the laws of this world, and was based on the worldview that this world followed. In other words, it was Luo Fan's worldview of laws. It could be said that even if this extraordinary power was developed to its peak, it wouldn't be able to break free from Luo Fan's control. On the contrary, the more it developed, the more Luo Fan would control it. However, all of this was meaningless to the boy right now. Although he had paid the price of distorting himself to break free from Luo Fan's control, it didn't mean that he still had to be wary of Luo Fan's control at all times. After all, the current him was no longer of any value to Luo Fan. Even if he fell into Luo Fan's control, it would no longer have any effect on his current situation. In particular, even if he didn't condense extraordinary powers according to the nature of this world, he was still completely under Luo Fan's control. In this way, he clearly didn't need to worry about anything. He only needed to work hard in the direction of making his life better. With the traces of memories left behind by his predecessor, the boy easily got rid of his powerlessness. In just a few dozen breaths, he had become an itinerant immortal and stepped into the third realm of Earth Immortals. Then, in just a few days, he crossed the 3 realms of Earth Immortals and went straight to the 3 realms of Primordial Unity. Finally, after spending 10 days to half a month, he completely broke through the 3 realms of Primordial Unity and became an innate Zenith Heaven. At this point, he finally stopped the process of breaking through. It wasn't that he was unable to continue breaking through and condensing his extraordinary power further. In fact, if he wanted to, he wouldn't need much time to directly become a false saint, a despairing one, a supreme emperor, or even a calamity stage expert. However, all of this was meaningless to him. Right now, the only thing that the boy wanted the most was peace and quiet. He wanted to live on. What power, what might, what benefits, to him, they were all indifferent things. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that an innate Zenith Heaven could be self-sufficient, greatly increasing his ability to survive and almost no dependence on the environment, he wouldn't even have the thought of becoming an innate Zenith Heaven again. Why would he have the thought of improving without a need? Chapter 2963. After sending the predecessor of the worlds to a parallel place in the world of laws, Luo Fan threw it to the back of his mind. To him, the predecessor of the worlds was no longer of any value. All he needed to care about was making sure that the worlds couldn't get something it didn't want from it. Under such circumstances, it didn't matter how the predecessor of the worlds chose to survive or what attitude it chose to use to face the endless years ahead. He only needed to ensure that it couldn't leave the world of laws and fall into the hands of the world's will. It's really a huge amount of memories. It's going to be a huge project to sort them out. Sensing the memories that belonged to the world's will that he had just obtained, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel emotional. These memories were all-encompassing, and most of their contents were messy. They filled every inch of the entire memory in an almost disorderly state. Wanting to find the valuable things in such memories was as difficult as finding a specific drop of water in a boundless ocean. However, difficulty was just difficulty. For Luo Fan, this was just a project that required some effort, and there was no real insurmountable barrier. At this moment, Luo Fan was fully immersed in those memories and began to classify them at an unimaginable speed. As he categorized these memories, they began to gradually separate in his heart. It felt like the beginning of the primordial world and the beginning of the world. Everything in the world started to gradually appear in this memory. These memories were the memories of the world's will, and the world's will itself was formed from the spirituality of everything in the world. At the very least, this was the essence of the world's will in this simulated state of chaos. Therefore, the memories of the worlds were naturally formed from all the memories of everything in the world. In this case, if the origin of those memories were truly separated, one would naturally find endless traces that belonged to all things in the world. Obviously, this was what Luo Fan was doing at this moment. Luo Fan had actually obtained some memories of the world before. However, what he had previously obtained was the memory of the world's will of the perfected world, and not the memory of the world's will in front of him, which was an incarnation of the chaotic world's will. The scale of the two was as if one was in the sky and the other was on the ground. The profoundness and profoundness of the two were like the distance between heaven and earth. Even though he had only just begun to sort it out, Luo Fan could already feel a greater, more vast, and even more advanced mystery gradually diffusing than that of the perfect world. These memories really contain some kind of extremely profound mystery. At a certain moment, such a thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind. Even if he had forced the predecessor of the worlds to give up on himself for these memories, it seemed that it was definitely worth it. Separating these memories was clearly not enough for him to obtain what he wanted to obtain, the mysteries related to the nature of this great tribulation. If it was so easy, how could he have gotten his hands on these mysteries? The previous incarnation of the will of the heavens and earth would have obtained these mysteries long ago. Of course, this didn't mean that he didn't have any gains that surpassed the predecessor of the world will. After all, Luo Fan was a different existence from the predecessor of the world will. Even the difference in their nature was unbelievably huge. When he looked at the same things, the feeling he got was naturally completely different from the predecessor of the world will, even if those things were the memories of the predecessor of the world will. The difference between living beings and the world was extremely huge, after all. There were some things that only the world will could understand and feel, but there were also things that only living beings could understand and feel. For the same memories, the predecessor of the world will felt and understood them from the perspective of the world will. The conclusion he obtained was naturally completely different from the perspective of Luo Fan, who felt and understood them from the perspective of the world will. It was as if at this moment, Luo Fan vaguely felt an indescribable vein that was stringing everything together through the memories, or rather, information that was gradually being separated from the infinite spirituality of all things. That kind of meridian was so powerful, so vast, and so obscure. Even Luo Fan could only faintly sense it at this time. If he wanted to truly confirm the existence of that vein, or even see the truth of that vein, he didn't even need to think about it. In fact, it was extremely rare for him to be able to vaguely sense the network, and it meant that his senses were extremely sharp. After feeling the inexplicable existence of the veins, Luo Fan's main body has been wholeheartedly devoted to sorting out these memories. Compared to the network that could possibly represent the nature of the great calamity, the great battle that was currently going on in this great world had clearly become insignificant. Luo Fan's main body had completely shifted his attention away from the great battle in the world, but it didn't mean that he had completely given up on it. In fact, at this moment, the great battle didn't change because of Luo Fan's main body's choice at all. After all, in this great battle, Luo Fan's incarnation was directly involved. This incarnation of Luo Fan was essentially Luo Fan. Its direct participation was no different from Luo Fan's direct participation. Under its control, the development of the situation of the great battle was naturally no different from Luo Fan's direct participation. At this moment, Luo Fan's only remaining incarnation had fused with the three-legged cauldron and was constantly flickering everywhere in this world. Every time it flickered, a large area of the world would be completely destroyed, and every time it was destroyed, it would force the territory of the world's will to take action. It would use all sorts of strange postures to either dodge, face, or simply shift the world. It would change the position of the world, change the connection between the world, change the relative distance between the world, and change the relative position of the world. In the beginning, Luo Fan didn't know how it changed, and he didn't understand the purpose of the world's will, or rather, the man-made world's will. However, as he continued to probe and destroy the world and the territory of the world's will, the situation gradually changed. He gradually saw the purpose of the man-made world's will. At this time, the many changes happening in the territory of the will of heaven and earth were actually like a person moving his body and changing his posture. This movement and change was obviously to gather power, brew power, and prepare for a corresponding eruption. Although he didn't know how it brewed power, how it gathered power, and how it carried out a complete eruption, Luo Fan knew that its ultimate goal was definitely him. After understanding this, Luo Fan's incarnation naturally controlled the three-legged cauldron more actively and began to attack the many worlds in the territory of the world's will. Every instant, it flickered tens of thousands of times, destroying countless worlds and destroying trillions of lives. However, this speed of destruction was still rather slow for the vast territory of the worlds that covered almost the entire world. At the very least, even if the world's will, or rather the man-made world's will, did not take action and did not move the world, choosing to use the least amount of the world to receive the destruction of the three-legged cauldron, it would probably take tens of thousands of years to damage the territory of the world's will at this speed of destruction. A large body can really do whatever it wants. Occasionally, Luo Fan's incarnation could not help but sigh. In an ordinary war, if one party chose to use the man-made worlds will to deal with it, allowing the opponent to wreak havoc in their own territory and destroy their own power while the other party only dodged and retreated, it would clearly be courting death. However, at this moment, to the man-made world's will, this seemingly suicidal method was not only not suicidal in the face of the world's will's unimaginable size, but it was also an almost unsolvable method to deal with it. At the very least, at this moment, Luo Fan could not find an effective way to deal with the man-made world's will. He could only do his best to speed up the destruction of the world's will's territory, and try his best to choose the more crucial areas to destroy. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to have gained the upper hand, but in fact, he was in a rather awkward situation. On the surface, he seemed to be casually destroying the enemy's power, and his territory was also constantly expanding. The hole in the space where the world's will resided was also constantly expanding as he destroyed it. However, the situation was clearly tilting in a completely different direction from what it seemed on the surface. Who knew when the man-made will of the world would appear once again? And with the incredible power and might that he had paid a great price to condense, it would directly defeat Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron, and even his incarnation. Time slowly flowed by. Unknowingly, thousands of years had passed. During these thousands of years, Luo Fan's main body carried out his original plan and had been sorting out the memories that he had obtained from the previous world's will. He did not pay any attention to everything that his clone and clone had encountered, nor did he pay any attention to the great battle that was in full swing. In the battlefield of the great battle that covered the entire world, Luo Fan's clone seemed to have gained the upper hand. The number of worlds that he had destroyed while controlling the three-legged cauldron had long surpassed the limit of billions of trillions. Above, in the space where the world's will resided, the hole that reflected the size of Luo Fan's territory had unknowingly grown by thousands of times and looked like a colossus. It was so much so that one could even see the curvature of the vortex within the space where the world's will resided through the hole. Compared to the time when one could see the vortex but could only see a straight line and not the slightest curvature, it was already a huge improvement. At this moment, the expression of Luo Fan's clone in the three-legged cauldron did not ease up at all. On the contrary, compared to thousands of years ago, his expression was even more solemn. That was because he could vaguely sense that the man-made world's will was about to complete its brewing and gathering. Once this brewing and gathering process was completed, it clearly meant that his days in the future would not be easy. Facing such a situation, how could he relax? It's good that you're here. Let me see what you've brewed after paying such a huge price. At a certain moment, an indescribable impulse suddenly surged in Luo Fan's heart. Of course, although it was an impulse, it did not mean that he had given up resisting. Over the past thousands of years, he seemed to be constantly flickering and destroying the world within the territory of the world's will. But in reality, since he had already sensed the objective of the man-made world's will, it was naturally impossible for him to give up on finding a way to deal with it. Although there did not seem to be many changes, in reality, the location where he flashed with the three-legged cauldron would be inexplicably adjusted every time. Every time he appeared, he would sense that it might be a certain node where the man-made world's will was gathering its power and brewing its power. Of course, some of them were correct, while others were obviously wrong. Through these countless right and wrong choices, he had unknowingly found some sort of pattern. Although it was not to the extent of understanding the nature of the actions of the man-made will of heaven and earth. Although it was not to the extent of understanding the nature of the man-made world's will's actions, he could already vaguely sense the exact timing of the gathering and brewing of the man-made world's will. At a certain moment, when Luo Fan sensed that a drastic change was about to occur, a drastic change very naturally occurred. In the sky and under the sea, a boundless and terrifying pressure suddenly began to be born. The boundless pressure directly sealed all possible directions that Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron could move, causing the three-legged cauldron to be like a flying insect in a spider's web. The more it struggled, the tighter it was bound. Chapter 2964. At this moment, all sorts of indescribable existences were being emitted from every corner of the endless world within the territory of the will of the world. These existences began to gather towards the depths of the void through some unimaginable means. Finally, after going through extremely complicated changes, they formed the pressure that was currently entangling the three-legged cauldron. This pressure was so strong and so strange. Under this pressure, Luo Fan even felt that the three-legged round cauldron had been separated from everything in the outside world, and there was no longer any connection between them. In fact, he even discovered through his senses that this pressure had already penetrated the barrier of the realms and completely separated the reality from the many other realms. Due to this, Luo Fan's powerful dimensional division technique had clearly lost its original power. He knew that the reason why the dimensional division technique was so powerful and almost unsolvable was because it connected each dimension to the other realms. It could be said that he had borrowed the power of other planes to support the various dimensions, which was why the dimensional division technique had become so powerful and unsolvable. Under such circumstances, the power source of the dimensional division technique would naturally be cut off when the dimensional division technique was completely separated from the other realms. Of course, the dimensional division technique would not be as powerful as before. Die! At this moment, countless voices came from all over the world and finally converged into these two words. Following this voice, the surrounding light and shadow rapidly changed, and a boundless, hazy existence instantly replaced the originally orderly space-time, orderly nomological rules, and everything else. The moment this grayish existence appeared, Luo Fan had an inexplicable feeling. He seemed to have fallen into a state of chaos. His surroundings were filled with incomparably mysterious and inconceivable destructive power, a state of chaos at this moment. He even felt that the connection between his clone and his main body seemed to have been extremely weakened. Although there were still traces of the connection between his clone and his main body, these traces seemed to have crossed the barrier of the state of chaos. They seemed to be faintly discernible, and he could not even clearly communicate with them. Is this the technique you've been brewing all these years? Although Luo Fan's clone's fighting spirit did not decrease, his expression became rather solemn. Whether or not he had the will to fight was one thing, but whether or not he valued his opponent's attacks was another. At this moment, the man-made world was clearly too powerful. Although he did not completely lose his will to resist, he knew how difficult it was to defend against such an attack. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. The three-legged cauldron trembled slightly before exploding. In the blink of an eye, the entire treasure turned into a gray mass that resembled chaos. This kind of chaos was similar to the gray existence that was constantly being produced in the outside world and constantly filling up the interior. At a glance, one would easily confuse the two. At this moment, a terrifying power erupted from the grayish existence formed by the three-legged cauldron. Under this kind of eruption, the gray existence in the center separated from the upper and lower, the clear and the turbid. The clear ascended to the heavens, while the turbid descended to the earth. Just like that, it had unknowingly transformed into a world of its own. This world was extremely wild and primitive, but it was also extremely sturdy and powerful. Although this world was not considered big when it was just formed, its strength could not be underestimated at all. Even if the gray existence in the surroundings had an indescribably terrifying pressure that could completely destroy the world created by any creator of the world. However, in the face of this wild, primitive, and extremely rough world, the gray existence could not do anything at all. It was just like smoke colliding with a rock, constantly stirring up the smoke, but there was no way for it to cause any damage to the rock. At least, that was what it seemed like on the surface. At this moment, in the territory of the world's will, the endless world continuously released all sorts of indescribable existences into the depths of the void. Through conversion, they continuously gathered in the gray existence and continuously strengthened it, causing it to completely assimilate and destroy everything within its range. Along with this change, the gray existence did not waver at all, even when it encountered a powerful obstruction. It was still endlessly colliding with a world formed by the three-legged cauldron in the center. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone was floating in the air in that narrow space. His body seemed to have fused with this part of the world, and his aura was constantly inhaling and exhaling, complementing the aura of the world. The two seemed to have formed an extremely perfect cycle. At this moment, the clear and turbid chi in the rough world had not completely stabilized, and there was an unbelievably terrifying pressure outside, causing the world to become even more turbulent. Under such circumstances, the existence of Luo Fan's clone was like a stabilizing force that fiercely suppressed the entire world. No matter how this world changed, it remained mostly intact. However, this change did not come without a price. As this change continued, the connection between Luo Fan's avatar and this world became more and more intimate with every passing moment. In the beginning, one could still see the difference between Luo Fan's clone and this world. Although the aura of the two was interlinked and resonated with each other, they were ultimately two individuals. However, as time passed, as the external pressure grew stronger, and as Luo Fan's clone supported this world more and more, the difference between the two became more and more difficult to distinguish. After a few dozen breaths, Luo Fan's clone had completely fused with this incomparably wild and primitive world. The two had completely become one, two, and one. At this point, the aura that belonged to Luo Fan gradually increased in the world. And Luo Fan's clone also unknowingly carried the wild and primitive aura that belonged to that world. And this step was not the end. As the external pressure continued, the connection between the two became closer and closer. And this connection also made this world's ability to withstand the gray existence in the outside world become stronger and stronger. Even though the pressure produced by the grayish existence in the outside world was getting stronger and stronger, it was still able to hold on. It didn't become a mess because of the increasing pressure. At this moment, in the outside world, a huge vortex appeared around the gray existence. The gray existence wanted to envelop the three-legged cauldron, and it went without saying how vast it was. It must be known that the three-legged cauldron was originally as vast as the combination of billions of worlds at this moment. The massive vortex was still able to envelop the grayish existence. One could imagine just how massive the vortex was. It was only an understatement to say that such a huge vortex covered the sky and the sun. At this moment, the vortex, which was the manifestation of the man-made world's will, was already very different from the last time it appeared. The last time it appeared, the vortex didn't look any different from the vortex when the world's will appeared. However, this time, the vortex was filled with flowing lights and vibrant colors. It looked like a strange vortex that was formed by the convergence of countless types of energies. However, although it looked like it was formed by the gathering of countless types of powers, it didn't seem messy at all. Instead, everything seemed to be perfectly integrated, as if every bit of power had become an inseparable part of the whole. After the vortex appeared, it began to rapidly shrink. The area it occupied began to shrink continuously. In just a few breaths, the area it occupied had shrunk by more than half. As the area occupied by the vortex shrank, the grayish existence in the center of the vortex also endured a pressure that was at least 10 times stronger than before, causing the aura of chaos on the grayish existence to become even more intense. At the same time, inside the gray existence, in a world formed by the three-legged cauldron, Luo Fan's body trembled, and he felt that breathing seemed to have become more difficult than before. He couldn't be more clear about what this feeling meant. This clearly meant that the external pressure had become much stronger than before, and it had even begun to affect the flow of his aura. It should be time to proceed to the next step, right? At this moment, such a thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The man-made worlds was willing to let Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron destroy its body wantonly for thousands of years. In other words, in the territory of the world's will, the attack that it was brewing naturally wouldn't just be this terrifying pressure that appeared now. The pressure that appeared now was at most a vanguard, a precursor. And at this moment, it was obvious that this precursor had already brewed to a certain limit at this time. Just as this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, countless sharp blades suddenly appeared out of thin air in that grayish existence, fiercely stabbing towards the world formed by the three-legged cauldron. Chi-chi-chi-chi. Countless strange sounds came from the barrier between heaven and earth at this moment. Immediately afterwards, Luo Fan's body trembled violently. He felt endless pain coming from the world above him, allowing him to clearly feel the damage that the world had suffered in that instant. At this moment, his connection with the world was already so close that the two of them were one, so he would naturally feel the damage that the world had suffered. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's expression became even more solemn. In an instant, he mobilized the power of this world and gathered it towards the countless sharp blades, quickly destroying the sharp blades that were inserted into this world. Although the sharp blades were so powerful, this was Luo Fan's home ground. After all, the power of the world itself was strong enough, so the sharp blades were easily erased at this moment. However, this was clearly only the first step. Next, the sharp blades were produced continuously, and they stabbed towards the world continuously. Moreover, along with these sharp blades, there were even more attacks of all kinds and shapes. They followed the sharp blades and used the holes created by the sharp blades to continuously invade the world. Being surrounded in the center and enduring the endless attacks, this situation was clearly bad enough for Luo Fan. At this moment, faced with this change, even if Luo Fan wanted to stop it, he realized that for the time being, he could only face the other party's attacks and could not counterattack at all. Although the damage that the pressure could cause to the world was rather limited, it was clear that as a support, the effect of this pressure was quite significant. At the very least, under this pressure, Luo Fan could no longer move the world at will, and he could not even use the power of other levels to strengthen the world. Faced with this endless attack, Luo Fan could only constantly erase the attacks that had invaded his world and do his best to maintain the integrity of his world. Faced with this endless attack, Luo Fan could only constantly erase the attacks that had invaded his world and do his best to maintain the integrity of his world. The attacks were continuous, and it was like a never-ending cycle. After one wave was erased, another wave would come. Compared to the previous wave, this new wave had many corresponding changes and made up for the various loopholes that the previous wave had revealed. In this way, each wave of attacks was stronger than the last, each wave more difficult to deal with than the last, and each wave more serious damage to Luo Fan's world than the last. Faced with such an attack, Luo Fan naturally understood that this couldn't go on. Therefore, he carefully observed the gray existences around him. Although these gray existences were trying their best to simulate the state of chaos, even the source of the man-made world's will, the world's will, was only an incarnation of the will that simulated the state of chaos. How could such an artificial world will really create the state of chaos? It could be said that the gray existences around him could only be said to be a simulation of the state of chaos. Moreover, it was very likely to be a simulation that was not very brilliant. Chapter 2965. Now, he began to carefully observe his surroundings and comprehend everything around him. He finally discovered the various subtle discordant points in the grayish existence around him. These discordant points were hidden in the endless chaos. If one did not pay attention to them wholeheartedly, one would not be able to discover their existence at all. But now, to Luo Fan, those discordant points were so obvious. As he delved deeper into this disharmony, he soon discovered even more things that were incompatible with the state of chaos. The chaotic state that seemed flawless and flawless finally revealed its true appearance in his eyes. He could see all the crudeness and carelessness in it. So that's all. Looking at this scene, the pressure in Luo Fan's heart was greatly reduced. With just a slight movement of his heart, the world around him began to change slightly. Originally, this world was only passively enduring the endless attacks released by the grayish existence around him. Now, with a sudden change, the entire world seemed to have disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye, as if it had never existed. At this moment, the man-made worlds will sneered. Crude means, immediately after, the man-made worlds will surged, and the grayish existence inside the man-made worlds will also begin to surge even more violently. With this surge, the various dimensions that appeared out of thin air inside the grayish existence were shattered countless times in the blink of an eye. The grayish existence could even penetrate the barrier of the plane and completely cut off the connection between the real world and other planes. How could it not have a way to deal with the various dimensions that appeared in the real world? Previously, the method that Luo Fan chose was actually not too unbelievable. However, all he did was split out some dimensions out of thin air and hide himself in other dimensions. Of course, the current method of splitting the dimensions was mostly concentrated in the world formed by his three-legged cauldron, and it did not really touch the grayish existence around him. After all, the grayish existence had already penetrated the barrier of the plane, and it was already fully prepared for this method of splitting the dimensions. It was not impossible to split it up, but it was definitely not easy to do so. At this moment, the grayish existence that simulated the chaotic state activated the various defensive methods that it had originally made against the dimensions. It directly penetrated the dimensions and forcefully destroyed them, completely mixing up the dimensions that were originally separated. With this change, the world formed by the three-legged cauldron reappeared in the real world, or rather, it reappeared in the perspective of ordinary living beings. It seemed like the dodging from before had never happened. However, it was obvious that the method that Luo Fan used at this moment was not without reason. At this moment, the world formed by the three-legged cauldron trembled slightly and began to shrink rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into a three-legged cauldron again, floating in the boundless grayish existence. Dang, 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 dang. The numerous attacks released by the countless gray existences smashed onto the three-legged round cauldron, but only made the three-legged round cauldron emit such a sound. The three-legged round cauldron itself didn't even shake a bit. Of course, the three-legged cauldron at this moment seemed to be the same as the three-legged cauldron at the beginning, but its essence was actually completely different. The three-legged cauldron from before was a magic treasure. Although its level was extremely high and the method of its creation was extremely strange, it was indeed a magic treasure. However, the three-legged cauldron now was already a world of its own. The form of the three-legged cauldron was actually just the form of the barrier of this world. In other words, it was actually just a three-legged cauldron on the surface, and its essence was actually not much different from before. The reason why the previous barrier had no effect on the terrifying attacks released by the grayish existence was that it allowed those attacks to penetrate it continuously. However, the barrier that had turned into a three-legged cauldron could easily block the countless attacks outside, and it did not even shake at all. The reason was actually not complicated. This was because when the barrier turned into a three-legged cauldron, it naturally attached all sorts of indescribable concepts that belonged to the three-legged cauldron to the barrier at the same time. If these concepts existed alone, they naturally would not have any effect. At least, they would not have any effect on existences at the level of the man-made world. However, when this concept had Luo Fan support and that world support, the situation was obviously completely different. It was just like a blade. If it existed alone, it naturally would not pose any threat to others. However, if this blade was in the hands of a peerless swordsman, then it would be an exaggeration to say that it could destroy the world, but it would definitely be a piece of cake for it to massacre a city and destroy country. At this moment, the embodiment of Luo Fan in that world was that peerless swordsman. And that concept was that saber. When the two were combined, the effect produced was like this at this moment. The three-legged cauldron's strength directly disregarded the countless attacks released by the surrounding grayish existence. Of course, This was also because Luo Fan's embodiment had already found the countless crudities and imperfections in the surrounding grayish existence. This was because he had found the countless crudities and imperfections, allowing these concepts to have an opportunity to take advantage of. He was able to avoid the important and dwell on the trivial, and use his strongest point to meet the weakest point of the attacks. This was why he could perform so easily. It was just like a swordsman. Only by grasping the weakness of the object he wanted to cut could he truly be called peerless and easily cut through everything he faced. It was like facing a piece of steel. An ordinary swordsman would not be able to do anything about it. He could only rely on the strength of the weapon itself to resist the steel and use the material of the weapon itself to cut through the steel. However, if the swordsman was strong enough and brilliant enough, the situation would obviously be completely different. If the swordsman was brilliant enough, he would be able to clearly know the weak points of the steel itself and know where to cut through the integrity of the steel itself. If such a swordsman was brilliant enough, he might even be able to smoothly cut through the steel with a wooden blade. At this moment, Luo Fan was that swordsman. It was because he knew the various weaknesses and crudities of the surrounding grayish existence that he became a peerless swordsman. Only then could he rely on the concept of the three-legged cauldron to easily resist the various attacks released by the surrounding grayish existence. Of course, resisting was clearly not Luo Fan's goal. What he wanted was to cut open the surrounding grayish existence and destroy the attacks from the man-made will of the world. Faced with the endless attacks around him, Luo Fan took a while to adapt to it. Then, he began to turn the situation around and directly controlled the three-legged cauldron to crash into the surrounding attacks towards the depths of the grayish existence. Under this collision, the surrounding grayish existence was like ordinary flowing water. It did not resist at all as it was squeezed apart by the three-legged cauldron. It allowed the three-legged cauldron to easily squeeze into the depths of the grayish existence, leaving behind an incomparably clear mark that did not disappear for a long time. The grayish existence surged violently at this moment. Everything within, including time and space, was violently rioting at this moment. Everything and every bit of existence was constantly shifting, either to avoid, to welcome, to resist, or to be dragged in. All sorts of categories were extremely chaotic. The various attacks that continuously attacked the three-legged cauldron could no longer continue to exist at this moment. This change in the situation clearly meant that Luo Fan's choice was extremely effective. At this moment, outside the grayish existence, the incomparably huge man-made will of the world started to condense, and the various colors on it flickered crazily. As the colors flickered, an unbelievably terrifying power was constantly being generated from the depths of the vortex. It frantically gathered towards the grayish existence at the center, covering the sky and covering the earth like waves. At the same time, countless indescribable existences were frantically gathering in the boundless territory that belonged to the world's will. They were constantly gathering towards the vortex above, constantly supporting the man-made world's will, allowing the world's will to gather enough power to achieve any objective it wanted. Compared to the beginning, the vortex had unknowingly shrunk to a quarter of its original size. This degree of shrinkage had unknowingly increased the might and power of the man-made will by a few hundred times. The grayish existence within had also become increasingly dense during this process. It was so much so that even the roughness and loopholes that existed within it had been mended during this process. Just like how a large body could do whatever it wanted, it could also do whatever it wanted if it was sufficiently condensed. If anything was condensed to a sufficient extent, its nature would undergo various changes. Something that was originally a loophole would no longer be a loophole as it condensed to a greater extent. Something that was originally a loophole would no longer be a loophole as it condensed to a greater extent. At this moment, that was the case for the grayish existence. The three-legged cauldron continued to move deeper into the grayish existence. Along the way, it stirred up many loopholes, and roughness. However, these loopholes, loopholes, and roughness that were stirred up were completely annihilated as the grayish existence continued to condense, returning it to its initial smooth and stable state. All the consequences caused by the stirring were completely eliminated. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron was constantly shifting in the depths of the grayish existence. The suppressive force was gradually released from its body and started to extend towards the rough, loopholes, and loopholes within its range like tentacles. It continuously attacked those areas and tried its best to disintegrate the grayish existence. As it moved, pieces of space-time, worlds appeared out of nowhere within the range of the suppressive tentacles. When chaos was split, order would naturally be born. When order gathered, it would naturally turn to space-time, worlds. However, because Luofan's objective wasn't these heavens and earth, the numerous space-time, worlds, and heavens and earth that were born from these gray and hazy existences that he'd casually disturbed seemed extremely crude. It was even to the extent that even order was barely formed, and there was utterly no order that could truly exist for a long time. Because there was no stable order that could exist for a long time, not many living beings were born in those worlds. Even if there were occasionally some worlds in space-time that coincidentally gave birth to some living beings, those living beings were also extremely fragile, not to mention threatening the outside world. Even in those worlds in space-time, they could only exist for an extremely short period of time. A small disturbance would completely destroy those living beings. As the grayish existence condensed and changed, the space-time, worlds that were born from the suppression tentacles were quickly annihilated and turned into a grayish existence that was completely mixed up with the surroundings. From the looks of it, the three-legged cauldron left a trace formed by space-time, worlds that followed it as it moved forward. Soon, the three-legged cauldron arrived at its destination, on this special node of the grayish existence. This grayish existence was a simulation of the chaos loading simulation. As such a simulation, it was naturally impossible for it to construct a specific core to achieve any goal like an orderly existence. However, it did not take the initiative to construct a core, but it did not mean that there was no core. In fact, apart from a few things, almost everything had a core. The existence of such a core did not have any special meaning. Some cores were simply cores due to their location. Chapter 2966. This point that had become the core purely because of its position was naturally completely different from the points that had become the core because of their functions or other characteristics. In fact, there wasn't anything too strange about this in itself. The only things that could be used were the various characteristics of this special position itself. However, for Luofan, what he needed now was a certain characteristic of this special position and nothing else. At this moment, after arriving at the target location, Luofan controlled the three-legged cauldron and instantly stabilized this core position. In an instant, countless subtle laws spread out from the three-legged cauldron and started to fuse with the gray existence in the surroundings. The gray existence in the surroundings was controlled by the man-made will of the world, and it was a method that was specially used to target Luofan and the three-legged cauldron. Everything about Luofan, everything about the three-legged cauldron was naturally extremely repulsive. According to the nature of the gray existence, this combination was obviously extremely repulsive. The instant the two came into contact, the first reaction of the grayish existence was to completely destroy the laws of nature that were spreading out. Therefore, as the laws spread out, rumbling sounds continuously appeared around the three-legged cauldron. Although these sounds represented conflict and eruption, compared to the gray existence in the surroundings, this conflict and eruption was a kind of order in itself. This kind of order appeared in the gray existence and naturally separated into clear and turbid. It turned into space-time that began to stack and spread out in all directions. The laws that spread out from the three-legged cauldron naturally fused with these space-time and kept extending out as these space-time spread out. These space-time were just a combination of the explosive sound waves and the gray existence in the surroundings. It was easy to imagine how strong these space-time were. At this moment, the gray existence in the surroundings continued to condense and condense attacks in the direction of the three-legged cauldron. It was easy to imagine how long it could last. Practically in an instant, the surrounding space had already collapsed and disappeared without a trace from the surrounding attacks. What disappeared along with this space-time were the nomological laws of Luo Fan's three-legged cauldron that had fused with space-time. These laws fused with the space-time and were destroyed by the gray existence's attack, turning into countless fragments that fused with the surrounding gray existence. As the nomological laws were continuously integrated into the endless grayish existence through this indirect method, Luo Fan clearly sensed that the pressure the grayish existence exerted on the three-legged cauldron was gradually weakening. The nomological laws fused with his surroundings, but it wasn't enough for him to control the dusky existence around him. However, it was enough to change the affinity of the grayish existences around him. And because of this change, the surrounding dusky existence was no longer able to suppress the three-legged cauldron like before. The logic behind this was very simple. It was like a block of ice and a basin of water. If the state of the two remained the same, the water would naturally be able to cause considerable damage to the ice. However, if the ice turned into a ball of water, the situation would obviously be completely different. The water outside might be able to disperse the ball of water, but it definitely wouldn't be able to truly harm the ball of water. At this moment, the changes between the three-legged cauldron and the surrounding dusky existence were similar. Previously, the three-legged cauldron and the grayish existence were like a block of ice and boundless seawater. But now, the block of ice had unknowingly melted and was about to turn into clear water. An indescribable worry surged in the heart of the man-made world outside. Although everything was still under his control, and Luo Fan and the three-legged cauldron were still under his control, he vaguely felt that everything was slowly getting out of his control. Under this feeling, he urged the grayish existence even more energetically, producing all kinds of incredible attacks and continuously smashing towards the three-legged cauldron-shaped world in the center. Those attacks first came into contact with the space-time around the three-legged cauldron, erupting with earth-shattering commotion. They annihilated each other with the space-time, and in the process, they once again caused countless sound waves to fuse with the surrounding dusky existence, turning into endless space-time. In the three-legged cauldron, laws once again spread out and fused with the newly born space-time, changing the nature of the space-time, turning the space-time into the type that would instantly erupt with an earth-shattering sound wave once it received a destructive attack, and continued to stack up. As time and space surged, a hole that was getting bigger and bigger seemed to have been forcibly torn open in the core of this gray existence. This core position was not a point with a special function that was specially set by the grayish existence, but because of its position, it became the core of this grayish existence. With such a core position, it was naturally the center of this gray existence from all angles. Tearing a hole that was getting bigger and bigger in such a place would have an extremely far-reaching impact on the entire grayish existence. It was like a ball of plasticine. If you broke it in the center, a bigger hole would appear in that position. In the end, even the best result would be the plasticine being torn in half. In the worst case, the whole piece of plasticine would be torn apart and turned into countless fragments. At this time, this grayish existence was the plasticine. Under the control of Luo Fan, the three-legged cauldron, or in other words, under the guidance of the nomological laws of that world, the appearance of this hole continuously increased the destruction of the grayish existence. During this process, even if the grayish existence wanted to adjust its posture to reduce the influence of this hole, it couldn't do so. It could only watch as the hole caused more and more damage to the entire simulation of the chaotic state. At this time, the man-made world's willpower naturally understood that continuing to increase the attack was no longer of much use to Luo Fan. Increasing the attack would only allow more power to be used by Luo Fan, continuously increasing the destruction of the three-legged cauldron. Therefore, in desperation, he could only stop the attack on the three-legged cauldron. However, even if he stopped the attack, he still couldn't stop the space-time around the three-legged cauldron from continuing to appear and continue to stack and expand. This was because the grayish existence itself had amazing destructive power and assimilation ability. The space-time created by the sound waves was not qualified to exist for a long time in this grayish simulation of the chaotic state at all. As long as it came into contact with the surrounding grayish existence, it would collapse and be destroyed because it couldn't withstand the pressure and assimilation effect naturally emitted by the grayish existence. Due to the nomological laws that spread out from the three-legged cauldron, this collapse and destruction would naturally cause earth-shattering sound waves. This sound wave was the source of another wave of space-time. It continued to combine with the surrounding grayish existence, giving birth to order again, giving birth to space-time again, being injected by the nomological laws again, and stacking up again. In this way, a vicious cycle was formed, causing the whole of the grayish existence to expand endlessly. Although, judging from the scale of this grayish existence, even if this space-time continued to expand like this, it would probably take tens of thousands of years to really tear this grayish existence apart. However, this also represented a trend. It meant that the overall situation seemed to be leaning towards Luo Fan's victory. This was completely different from the previous state, where Luo Fan was exhausted and seemed to be on the verge of complete defeat. At this moment, the man-made worlds fell into an awkward situation. He wanted to attack, but he found that his attacks would only make his situation worse. Even if he no longer paid attention to Luo Fan, he would not show mercy because of this. He continued to attack continuously, and the situation was still getting worse. Could it be that I can only attack those worlds? At this moment, the man-made worlds fell into hesitation. He turned his gaze towards the countless worlds in Luo Fan's territory. The territories occupied by these worlds were vast, and although they were far from his territory, they were still quite astonishing in scale. Even if those worlds didn't resist, if he didn't attack and only relied on the cultivators in the worlds under his command, it would probably take tens of thousands of years to conquer those worlds. Moreover, how could those worlds not attack? They had been nurtured by Luo Fan's incarnation for so many years and had so many tribulation stage powerhouses. Their cultivation was also of the same lineage, and their compatibility with each other far exceeded the many powerhouses on his side. Once they gave it their all, the strength of the resistance that they could erupt with would definitely be unimaginably terrifying. Therefore, if the cultivators under his command attacked, even if they could obtain victory in the end, the time it would take would definitely not be a short tens of thousands of years. Tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, or even a billion years would not be an exaggeration. Once the time was dragged to tens of millions of years, or even hundreds of millions of years, the outcome of the battle at the bottom seemed to be meaningless. Don't forget that Luo Fan's situation was completely different from this man-made world's will. This man-made worlds was formed by the combination of the infinite power and power of the countless worlds in the territory of the world's will, as well as other mysterious existences. For the man-made world's will, the countless worlds in the territory of the world's will were its foundation, its source. Once there was a problem with these worlds, and they no longer had enough power to support it, it would start to regress and eventually collapse completely, unable to take shape again. Under such circumstances, the heavens and earths were extremely important to him. If there was even the slightest problem, it would be unacceptable. However, it was obvious that the situation was completely different for Luo Fan's incarnation. If it was before the three-legged cauldron had completely transformed, the worlds would still have a certain impact on Luo Fan's incarnation. After all, at that time, Luo Fan's incarnation was a bit of consciousness that was separated from Luo Fan's main body, and the incarnation grew by combining the power and power of those worlds. Its foundation was also those worlds. Once such a Luo Fan's incarnation had a problem with those worlds and could no longer support its existence, its strength would naturally be greatly reduced. At that time, The man-made worlds while attacking the worlds in Luo Fan's territory would naturally have an extremely strong effect. However, that was only in the past. Now, after the three-legged cauldron had successfully transformed and Luo Fan's incarnation had fused with the three-legged cauldron, the foundation of Luo Fan's incarnation's existence had clearly changed. It was no longer an incarnation that could only be formed by borrowing the power of countless worlds. He had already transferred the foundation of his existence to the three-legged cauldron. For him, the three-legged cauldron had already replaced the original role of the world and became the source that supported his existence. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan's incarnation could forcefully push his cultivation realm to the peak of the seventh tribulation. It was also precisely because of this that Luo Fan's incarnation would not be affected no matter how many of Luo Fan's territories were destroyed or disappeared. As long as the three-legged cauldron was not destroyed or damaged, Luo Fan's incarnation would be unharmed. He would still maintain the peak cultivation realm of a seventh tribulation expert, and he would still be able to fight against the man-made world's will. After thinking this through, the man-made worlds will no longer had any thoughts of attacking the many worlds in Luo Fan's territory. Attacking the worlds in Luo Fan's territory would only disperse his power, and it would not be of any help to the final result. What was the point?